Okay, so we should be recording now. Welcome everyone. This is the first, well, I guess second, but the first official teach-in that I'm hosting on Palestine, and this is a teach-in for liberation. Before we get into the history of the situation in Palestine and the current goings-on today, I just want to reaffirm what the point of this teach-in is. Right? A teach-in is a form of activism in which you use your skills as an educator to inform the public on different issues. The whole point is just that it is informative. It gives a clear understanding of the issue at hand, and then the power is really in your hands as the viewers to decide what you want to do with that information. Now, if you decide that you would like to take some action, I will give you some action items at the end. I will also post in the chat a link to this presentation so you can review the slides whenever you'd like, and also a link to a document, a Google Doc, in which I'm populating different resources. There's also going to be a link to a Google form where if you find a resource that you think is great and you want to share it with more people, you can always submit it through that Google form, and I will be adding things to the Google Doc as we go along. When you first see it, you will notice that it's a little sparse right now because my focus has been on the presentation more so than the supplementary information. But I'm hoping to later on in today get that fixed. For those who are not watching live and may be watching this on the YouTube recording, all of those links will also be in the description box. Okay, with that being said, here we go. Palestine, a teach-in for liberation. Okay, so I've modeled this sort of after my teaching background. So anyone who's a teacher knows that you have your lesson objective that you usually put in I will or I can statements, so that students understand what they're supposed to get out of the lesson by the end. So obviously you're not my students, so I'm not going to pretend like that there's that relationship, but my hope is the purpose of this lesson is to introduce viewers to a brief history of the land that makes up Palestine and its people and give context to the most recent violence still happening in the country. At the end of this lesson, I will, in terms of our lesson objectives, understand the history of Palestine, understand the ongoing occupation of Palestine, be able to debunk common myths about the occupation, be able to identify propaganda strategies and misconceptions in US media, and have specific action items I can take home to make an impact if you choose to do so. You'll notice there are little asterisks on these slides. Those 2 points are going to be basically a more interactive section, specifically the one about common myths and perceptions. My hope is that after you've received all this information, you'll be able to make these arguments on your own. Of course, I will provide some answers just for clarity's sake, but the point is once you know the history, it's very easy to argue the case. So we're going to start with that history. As a poet myself, I have some poetry on these slides. This is from Mahmoud Darwish. A stranger on the riverbank, like the river, water binds me to your name. Nothing brings me back from my far away to my palm tree, not peace and not war. Mahmoud Darwish is was a Palestinian poet. And this is from his poem, Who Am I Without Exile, which is translated by another poet, Fadi Judah. So in looking at the history of Palestine, one of the complicated, so-called complicated portions of it is just how long that history is. On this slide, you can see a timeline of the different states that have existed on the land that we call Palestine. Now, when we talk about Israel's right to that land, we're looking at these 2 periods. You can see the color coding on this is a Hebrew or Jewish society. So we have the United Israelite Monarchy and Judah, and then the Hasmonean Kingdom. I always screw up that name, right? But when we're talking about the modern conflict and what's actually happening in the country today, we're really focusing on the legacy of this small portion of history, starting with the fall of the Ottoman Empire, then the British Mandate, then the formation of the State of Israel as we know it today. So this presentation is really going to start in that little red square. It's going to start with sort of the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Now, before we get to that, we need to talk about Zionism. So Zionism, in this case, we're going to start with sort of a more original Zionism, or more popular one, which was Christian Zionism. So before there was the Zionism of today, there was originally a form of Christian Zionism, which is still in effect today, especially in evangelical circles. And this was the belief that in order for the end times to happen, all of the Jewish people have to move into Palestine or Israel, set up a state there so that the Messiah will come back, the second coming of Christ usually. And in that second coming, he will either convert the Jewish people to Christianity or slaughter them if they refuse. So that's Christian Zionism, right? The support of moving Jewish people to the state of Israel in order to start the end times. Right. Now, Christian Zionism was more popular for much longer than what we know as Jewish Zionism today. And in fact, I think calling it Jewish Zionism is a mistake, but I'm just using it in terms of the description of who is promoting one form of Zionism and who is promoting the other side. But this modern effect of Zionism was the belief in the establishment of a Jewish homeland. And this was really developed in response to the anti-Semitism that was so prevalent in Europe, right? It's no secret that the history of Jewish people in Europe is a very brutal one, not just in our more contemporary times, but even in the distant past. You can think of the pogroms, you can think of inquisitions, you can think of all of those terrible moments in history in which Jewish people were persecuted, murdered, and in many ways ethnically cleansed, right? So seeing this anti-Semitism, there were sort of two modes of thought within the Jewish diaspora. Obviously, there's more than two, but these are the two main ones. The first one is that assimilation is the way to go, right? So what is termed the Jewish Enlightenment period, where groups are really looking at, we want to revive things about Judaism, like we want to revive the Hebrew language, we want to, embrace our customs and our culture, but we also want to be seen as equal citizens in the places that we live, so we must assimilate, right? Anyone who has any background in immigration of any kind, or even just the histories of minorities in the United States in particular, or in various parts of the world, right? There's always this battle of how much should I assimilate and how much should I retain of my own culture, right? When I am living somewhere. So on one side, we had the Jewish Enlightenment that was really focusing on assimilation. And in response to that, we get Zionism, right? The reality of anti-Semitism in Europe made it very hard for people to believe that they would ever be fully assimilated, that they would ever be fully accepted, that they would always be strangers in whatever land they were living in. And when you look at the history, you can see why that conclusion was made, right? There's a lot of backing in terms of European anti-Semitism that would lead one to that conclusion, right? So while many claim that there are multiple versions of Zionism, the fundamental principle of all of these versions is basically, in order to create a Jewish homeland, wherever it is created, there must be a Jewish demographic majority in that land. All right. The idea is that Jewish people will not be safe if they are not in control of their own state. Again, looking back on the history of European anti-Semitism, it is understandable to see why that conclusion was made. So we get to political Zionism, and that was founded by Austrian-Hungarian Jewish journalist Theodor Herzl, who many of you have probably heard of before, right? He established the World Zionist Conference. He was really sort of the first person to really galvanize the movement And part of the things that he did was raise funds from the British as well as others, especially a lot of American evangelicals, to get money to buy land from the British in order to set up a Jewish homeland. Now, Herzl's original idea was the Uganda proposal, which was basically British occupied Uganda would be sold to the Zionists in order to establish a homeland there. So that was the original proposal. Now, you may be thinking, why Uganda? I'm thinking that too. Why Uganda? Well, that was pretty short-lived when we get to a new leader in the movement, Chaim Weizmann. Right, so Chaim Weizmann was really the architect of focusing specifically on Palestine as the land that would become the Jewish homeland. Right, in his estimation, Palestine was underpopulated with plenty of empty space. And this was actually a myth that was perpetuated throughout all of the discussions of Zionism at the time and even till today. Right, so Weizmann, as with many of his successors, was obsessed with the demographic realities of the area of Palestine. Remember that in order for a Jewish homeland to be safe, they need to be the majority. You have to construct that majority. So, at the time of Weizmann's ascension in the 1900s, Palestine's demographics were as follows. This is from the Jewish Virtual Library, and specifically, this is the year 1914. So there were 689,000 people total in Palestine, so clearly not underpopulated, right? Of that population, non-Jews made up 86.4%, and the Jewish inhabitants, so these are Palestinian Jews, made up 13.6%. Palestinian Jews, as well as the immigrants from the Aliyah movements, right, where Jewish people were escaping pogroms in Europe and moving out to find safety. Right, so we have 13.6% of the population at the time, right? That's a higher estimate. That's not just including the original Palestinian Jews who were already there, right? That's including all the people who immigrated. So, keeping those figures in mind, right, Weizmann was successful during World War I in winning over many influential leaders, right? He was much more aggressive than Herzl ever was, right? And some of the people he brought to his side were people like Arthur Balfour, who is a former prime minister and foreign secretary of the British Empire, Churchill, and Mark Sykes. Remember those two names, Balfour and Sykes, because they will come back. Now, I have a quote here from Sykes, Mark Sykes, that I think is important to keep in mind. Remember that the idea was Palestine is underpopulated. Nobody's really there. Nothing's there. It's just land right there for the taking, right? And so Sykes, in response to this myth, says, if the Zionists do not go there, meaning to Palestine, someone will. Nature abhors a vacuum. Keep that quote in mind as we go through. Now, really where we see Zionism getting its roots and firm foundation is really in the peace negotiations of 1919. So Weizmann was given access and time, in contrast to any of the Arab or Palestinian delegates, such as King Faisal, who was accompanied on the trip by T.E. Lawrence, otherwise known as Lawrence of Arabia. All right, the book Paris 1919 by Margaret Macmillan actually has a lot of great information, and there's a whole chapter that's dedicated to the negotiations over Palestine, which I think would be very interesting reading for anyone who's inclined to do more reading after this. But that's basically the foundation of Zionism. That is since the 1800s, well into the 1900s, right? Political Zionism and the Zionism that we see today, that's where its roots and foundations are. Right, so let's look at the actual territory of Palestine, starting with the Ottoman Empire. Remember that small square of time that we're really looking at is the modern era, or anyway, closer to our era than any of the others, right? So in 1516, the land known as Palestine was captured by the Ottoman Empire in the Battle of Marj-Zabik. 1517, Hebron attacks, which were described as a pogrom, right, and were a pogrom, where basically the Ottomans attacked Jewish residents and expelled them, but many of them, in fact, did return by 1533. Right, so I don't want to sugarcoat the Ottoman Empire, and I don't want to make it seem like the Ottoman Empire was just so nice to all of their, subjects. We clearly know that is not the case, right? Historical record has proven that. So even within Palestine, there was still anti-Semitism, not as harsh and not as big as what was in Europe, but it still existed. There was still that danger, right? So by 1742 to 1777, Jewish Hasidic people move into the territory. Again, this is mainly in response to the anti-Semitism in Europe and what's going on there. 1799, Napoleon conquers some of the territory. By 1808 to 1810, 501 Ashkenazi Jewish families moved to the territory. For those who are not familiar, Ashkenazi Jews are a certain ethnicity within Judaism. So there's Ashkenazi, there's Mizrahi, there's Sephardi, there's Black Jews, such as Ethiopian Jews. These are all different groups within the umbrella term of Jewish person, right, or Jewish people. Right, 1897, the first Zionist Congress is held in Switzerland. This is hosted by Herzl. Weizmann, interestingly enough, is not there. He's not able to attend, but he attends every single one after, from the second on. 1916, McMahon-Hussein correspondence results in an Arab revolt against the Ottomans. So in order for the British to gain a foothold in the Middle East, they persuaded the Arabs to fight the Ottomans in exchange for independence, right? That they would be given their own autonomy. And this promise worked. And so they fought against the Ottomans, weakening them significantly, right? Then we also get the Balfour Declaration and the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Those names should be familiar. Remember, Weizmann did a really good job of finding friends in high places. And one of them was Arthur Balfour, who then authored the Balfour Declaration that basically established the British commitment to the state, to the establishment of a Jewish state in the land of Palestine, right? At the same time, Mark Sykes is meeting with his French counterpart, Picot, and they become enmeshed in this wheeling and dealing where they basically carve up and divide the Arab world, the Middle East, with no input really from anybody else, right? So in this case, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, Palestine is then given to the British, and Syria is given to the French. Right, so we get to the British Mandate of Palestine, right? In 1918, the British take over the territory and name it the Mandate of Palestine, or Mandatory Palestine. I always feel like Mandatory Palestine sounds weird, like you must Palestine. Anyway, 1929, rising tensions between Palestinian and Zionist groups result in a series of riots. For more detailed information, a lot of Ilan Papp's, I hope I'm saying his name right, his work, he's an Israeli historian, and he does a lot of really good work in sort of talking about these early tensions and what created them. Norman Finkelstein is also another good historian to look up. So 1936 to 1939, the Great Palestinian Revolt against British occupation. At this point in the history, they know about the dual promises, right? They know that there's a promise for a Jewish homeland. At the same time, there's a promise for Palestinians and Arab independence. And that increases the tensions. Now, what was not very much known during this time was that one side was getting funding and training in combat, and the other side was not. You can guess which. So 1947, the British decide, this is too complicated. We're already dealing with India and Pakistan and all the things that are going there. Our empire is crumbling. So let's just pass this off to someone else. And they pass it off to the United Nations. So the United Nations has a resolution proposing the creation of an Arab state and a Jewish state in Palestine, and it passes. However, no local people or leaders were involved in the negotiations from the side of the Palestinians. They had no say in this resolution that was decided for them. about their land and their livelihoods. And we come to the end of the British Mandate of Palestine with the Nakba. So Nakba is the Arabic word for catastrophe. Okay. And this is in 1948. So on May 14th, 1948, Israel declares its independence. That same night, the British Mandate ended exactly at midnight, and war broke out. So Zionist forces, who, as I said earlier, had been steadily amassing arms and training for years, expelled 700,000 Palestinians from their homes, around half of the population of the Palestinians at the time. Eventually, 80% of the Palestinians were turned into refugees. Remember, the demographics matter. You cannot have a Jewish state without a Jewish majority, according to the Zionists of the time, right? So often we think of Nakba as just 1948, but in reality, to Palestinians, the Nakba is ongoing, right? So it may have begun on May 14th, May 15th, but that catastrophe continues till today. I want to point you to the picture that I have here. So this Palestinian man is holding the key to his home, which he fled during the Nakba in 1948, right? Keys are actually a big symbol in Palestinian resistance because many of the people who were forced to flee for safety, right, blocked their homes and took their keys with them. Now, this might seem funny to those who haven't experienced what it's like to quickly evacuate from a place. But I will say from my parents' experience of having to forcibly leave Kuwait during the 1990 occupation of Kuwait by Iraq, yeah, my parents locked their doors and took the key and left, even though when they came back, door was busted, everything was looted, right? It's not rational, but it's habit, right? But these keys become an enduring symbol. Okay, so let's talk about the turning point. And the real turning point in terms of the conflict and in terms of the occupation comes in 1967 with the 6 Days War. And the legacy of the 6 Days War pretty much covers everything up until today, right? That is where the Israeli state really found its grounding and how it was going to deal with its future, right? So for a more in-depth look in the lead up of the 6 Days War and its impact, Ilan Papp's The Biggest Prison on Earth is a great book to read. And it really goes point by point systematically into that history and the buildup. I'm just going to give some summarizing points, right? In 1948, Israel made an agreement with Jordan, which prevented them from occupying the West Bank. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, would describe this as a fatal historical mistake, right? Not taking over the West Bank. Keep that in mind. So in 1958 and 1960, to occupy the West Bank, Israel had actually made plans, but they didn't go forward with those plans for two reasons. On the slide, it says for the fear of the international reaction. The second reason was actually David Ben-Gurion himself did not want to occupy the West Bank anymore because he feared that the influx of the large Palestinian population would ruin the demographic majority of the Jewish state. If you bring them in and they are now citizens and they get to vote and they get to do everything that a citizen gets to do, we no longer have a Jewish majority and therefore we no longer have a Jewish state in his view, right? So when we think of the 1967 6 Days War, the war is often, even to this day, blamed on Arab nations that attacked Israel in June of that year. However, the historical record shows an escalation of Israeli aggression in the lead up to the war, such as encouraging settlements in disputed territories between it and Syria, and the Israeli push to control the water sources of the River Jordan and siphon it away from Syria and Lebanon, right? There were also a lot of skirmishes and dogfights and battles happening well before the official start of the war. So Ben-Gurion, as I said before, still worried about demographic realities, ultimately was against the occupation of the West Bank, right? So from 1963 to 1966, Israel actually cultivated a group of scholars and academics and lawyers to really think about, well, how would we, if we were to occupy the West Bank, how would we do it? Keep in mind the dates, 1963 to 1966. This is about 4 years before the actual 6 Days War happened, right? If the 6 Days War was a war of self-defense in which the Arab nations were planning an attack on Israel, and so Israel had to attack first, why were they planning to occupy the West Bank 4 years before the events of that war? Okay. So with those studies, they basically figured out a way to solve the demographic problem. We will take the land, but not grant any rights to the Palestinians. That way, we have all of the land that we want, but we don't have to actually deal with the demographic shift. So in April 1967, Israel attacked the Syrian forces in the Golan Heights. In response, Egypt closed the Strait of Tiran, preventing ships from getting into the Israeli port of Eilat. And then on June 5th, Israel launched its attack, starting the war. Right. Again, our ideas of what started the war versus the actual historical record often split in a very similar way. And we'll explore that more as we get into today. All right, so at the end of the war, Israel occupied all of Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. No longer in fear of international reaction, since there was virtually none at the time, Israel continues to occupy these areas in the present time, right? And we'll talk about those, of what it looks like in Palestine today and what it looks like to live there today. So since then, the peace process has been focused on the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. This is sort of this is why the 6 Days War is a turning point, right? Prior to 1967, prior to the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the idea of a Palestinian homeland was built on the 1947 borders established by that UN deal made in 1947, right, that we talked about earlier. And also the right of return for the Palestinians who became refugees in the Nakba. Now, since then, since the occupation, the discussion is really centered around settlements in the West Bank and the fate of the Gaza Strip. No longer are we looking at the boundaries that were established in 1947, let alone the actual historical territory of Palestine itself. Again, for more information on these topics, such as the first and second intifadas, which we skipped over, the Oslo Accords, Camp David Accords, and all those, see Ilan Papp's work, among others. And that's why there's that document to give you more resources, because obviously in the time that we have, we can't cover everything. So here are the proposed solutions. The two main solutions that have been presented for the so-called Israeli-Arab conflict is a two-state solution and a one-state solution. And this is the part where we're going to be a little bit more interactive. So if you want to unmute yourself, feel free to do that. Remember, if you don't want your face to appear on the recording, just keep your camera off. All right, so the two-state solution is basically establishing two separate states, one for Israel and the other for Palestinians, right? And this is actually the most popular solution in the international community. This is the official stance of most international actors, particularly the United States. Now, the one-state solution seeks to establish one democratic government with equal rights and protections for Israelis and Palestinians alike under a shared government. Looking at these two options, and just based on what you know right now, right, whatever information you're already coming into with, what solution do you think is best and why? If you're uncomfortable speaking, if you're uncomfortable speaking, you can also just type a comment in the chat and I'll read it out loud.
Well, obviously, I think personally these two options are neither really satisfactory for any Palestinian, I think. However, of the two, I think the two-state solution would probably be the more ideal if we had to choose one, simply for the fact that they have their own state, that their own land, not being dictated by a foreign force of any sort, if that makes sense.
Okay, fair enough. just a show of, I guess we could do a show of hands, or you can use the thumbs up react. How many of you are also, as of right now, on the side of the two-state solution, believing it is the better option of the two? I see one thumbs up. I see some people don't have a preference, another thumbs up. Okay, so let's just say, just based on who's here, we have sort of a slight majority in favor of the two-state solution. So I want you to look at, we're going to look at an interactive map that shows sort of the land divisions of Palestine over the years. And I want you to keep in mind these two solutions. So here we go. Notice the land control numbers at the top of that video. We're at 97% for Arabs. That just went down to 95, 5% for Jews, 5.5% for Jews. Now you can see the 1947 map, then 1947 to 1949, and now 1967 to 1993. Land control since then, since 1967 to 1993 and to the present day, Arabs control 0% of the land and Israel controls 100% of it. Right, so you can see that on the side there, there's, and again, this is linked, so when I give you the slides, you can actually look more closely at each of these sources. But you can see here that in terms of land division, there's almost no distinguishing between what parts Israel actively controls legally based on international agreements and illegally based on their occupation. So, is the two-state solution still viable? If you still think the two-state solution is still viable, what do you think would need to happen to implement that two-state solution? What steps would need to be taken? I see that in the comments, it was written, I worry that two states means Palestine is attacked and conquered the first day. That is an interesting point of view. Right, and I think that's something I would like to return to eventually, but I do want to just focus on this question right now, which is how would we make, given the reality on the ground, how would we make a two-state solution currently?
Honestly speaking, is it actually possible at this stage? If you think about it from any point of view, I can't really see a situation where any side would agree to it, especially since clearly no one's actually doing anything in response to Israel's aggressions. Palestine can keep speaking, but no one supports them, and that's the problem. So a two-state solution really doesn't work if only one side is getting all the power, does it?
Okay, so that's one thing that I see a question in the chat here that says, how would the land be divided? And underneath that, this comment actually, I think, answers the question, or at least exemplifies the complexity of that question, right? I don't have enough to make a solid recommendation, but the current Israeli government hasn't exactly acted in good faith, i.e. treating people fairly. But communities and settlements are very mixed together. Everyone would have to leave their homes to split the land. And that's the point, right? So my background is as a Pakistani, and my family was originally there for, thousands of years. On my mother's side, they were in the city of Lahore, and that's where they were from. On my father's side, they came from a place shortly outside of Amritsar, which is now on the Indian side of the border, right? Anyone who knows the history of Pakistan and India and Bangladesh knows that partition was particularly bloody, particularly brutal, and in many ways, did nothing to really stop the animosity on either side. Maybe in the future I'll do a teach-in on what's going on in India today and Pakistan. But for now, just think about it. The stereotype is those two countries hate each other, which they do, right? So even splitting, even the bloody partition did not stop that hatred. How many wars have Pakistan and India been in since 1947 when they were established, right? Okay, so that's the biggest step. If we were to create two states, who would be forced to move and where? And how would they be compensated for that move? How would the move be enforced? Would people get a choice? Maybe they say, I want to be a citizen of this place so I can stay in this home, rather than being forced to move to another place. Who knows, right? But we have seen this in practice in history. We know what partition looks like. All right, so we're going to transition now into modern day Palestine. So as you listen to this part of the lecture, I want you to try and answer this question. What kind of life are you willing to accept for yourself? Right. Basically, I want you to think of what are your aspirations for your own life? How would you like to live in the world? Right. And just think about that. And what are you willing to accept, as in what is the lowest threshold that you'd be willing to take, right? It's not ideal. Maybe it's very less than ideal, right? But you're willing to accept living this way, right? So we're into Palestine Today. Right, so this is also another poem. This is from Muhammad al-Kurd. And if you recognize that name, it's because he is one of the main leaders of the movement right now in Sheikh Jarrah. And this is from his poem, The Biggest Punchline of All Time. I fear this poem will turn eulogy in real time. Sheikh on the screen babbles about relief. It is what comes after patience. After patience, there is but a grave, Teta says. Teta is the word for grandmother. All right, so let's talk about official policy in Israel, in the state of Israel, and how that affects the land of Palestine. All right, so we're setting the stage. How are Palestinians and Palestine organized today? You can look at this as 4 groups. The largest group is the Palestinians in diaspora. They are the survivors of the Nakba and their descendants. They live all over the world, and currently they are numbered at around 6 million people. Right, so these are the people who fled and managed to get to other places. Majority of the Palestinians in diaspora, I think the biggest populations are in places like Jordan, still to this day. Then we have the Arab Israelis. And there's an asterisk there, because this term is a designation created by the Israeli authorities and is rejected by many Arabs within Israel who see themselves as Palestinians. Right, so these people are Palestinians who were basically in the territories that Israel gained when they claimed their independence and broke out into war in 1948. So the Arab Israelis are either Palestinians or other Arabs who have Israeli citizenship. Their population within Israel stands at 1.9 million currently. Then we have the 2 occupied areas, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, again, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are both considered internationally as Palestinian territory, that if there was the creation of a Palestinian state, those areas would be part of that state. So Israel actually has no legal right to them under international law, right? In the West Bank, there are 2.7 million Palestinians currently living there. And in the Gaza Strip, which is a small piece of land about the size of Detroit, it is home to 2.048 million Palestinian citizens. That is more than the population of Detroit. So the same land mass as Detroit, but a larger population. It is one of the most densely populated places on Earth. All right, so let's talk about Palestinians in the diaspora. How are they treated by the state of Israel? Right, so there are around 6 million Palestinians living around the world. and they live in various places. Depending on their location, some have citizenship in their adopted countries, but many are still regarded as refugees and live in camps. Yes, those refugee camps that exist in the borders of Jordan, of Lebanon, of those areas, they are still fully functioning refugee camps where people are born, live, and die, where they spend their whole lives now in the 73 years that Israel has existed. Okay, so let's look at two cases. Now, these are from Visualizing Palestine, which is a great organization, and they work with Human Rights Watch, right? And they create these graphics to sort of showcase some of the disparities. And that's what I'm going to show you now. So, born unequal abroad, right? On one side, we have Hannah, a Jewish American born in the United States. On the other side, we have a Palestinian refugee, Layla, born in Lebanon. I think that it's interesting that they chose born in Lebanon, because if you choose, you could also apply this to any Palestinian who's born in the United States as well. Right. Can I visit Israel and the occupied Palestinian territory? For Hannah, yes, you can visit Israel and most of the West Bank, and you'll find programs that may help fund your trip. So if you've ever heard of birthright trips, right? A Jewish person has the ability to go to Israel, all expenses paid, as a way to sort of advertise living there, right? And the side of Layla, no, you're barred from entry to Israel, the West Bank, or Gaza. Can you move there? On one side, yes, because you're Jewish, the 1950 law of return guarantees your right to live in Israel. On Layla's side, no, as a Palestinian refugee, you're barred from returning and denied residency rights, even if you still have family living there. Can I become an Israeli citizen? For Hannah, yes. For Layla, no. Right, the 1952 citizenship law entitles a person like Hannah to automatic citizenship, even if they've never set foot in Israel before. Whereas on Layla's side, you're ineligible if your family became refugees between 1947 and 1949, even if they had lived there for generations before. Right. Finally, can I pass on my legal status to my spouse in Israel or the occupied Palestinian territories? Immigration through marriage is a very common thing. That's how I immigrated to the United States and became a citizen, was through my marriage to Will. Right. On Hannah's side, yes. Upon becoming a citizen, you can pass along legal status and even citizenship to your spouse, except if they are Palestinian from the occupied Palestinian territories or from several Arab countries. So there's a specific distinction of who you cannot pass your citizenship onto. So tough luck, Hannah, if you fall in love with a dude named Abdullah who's from the occupied territories. Sucks for you. All right, next one for Layla. No, she has no legal status and cannot gain one, even by marrying a citizen or resident of Israel. There is no option for her to ever gain citizenship. So those are the Palestinians in diaspora. Now we have the Arab Israelis, right? The Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. How are they treated? Right, this is our second group. These citizens are descendants of the 150,000 people who stayed within Israel's borders during the 1948 Nakba. Again, right, they didn't move. They stayed where they lived and the border changed on them, right? Their movements are restricted and they can only live in designated Arab areas. Their homes and property are often confiscated, as is happening in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan today, which we'll talk about. Right, so again, born unequal, this is the Negev. Right, on one side we have Meretz, a Jewish citizen of Israel born in an Israeli town. On the other side we have Wasim, Palestinian citizen of Israel, born in unrecognized Bedouin village, but he is a citizen. Keep that in mind. These are both citizens of the state of Israel. So, is my community recognized by the government? On Meretz's side, yes. As part of the policy to Judaize the Negev, Israel actively nurtures the development of Jewish communities in the Negev. On Wissam's side, no. Israel does not recognize 35 Palestinian Bedouin communities, making it impossible for 90,000 or so residents to live lawfully in their homes. can I access basic services, right? As a citizen of a place, you become entitled to certain resources or services, right? On Neret's side, yes, likely without any obstacles, thanks to billions of shekels, Israel has invested in major infrastructure projects to attract Jewish residents to the area. On Wissam's side, obviously no. Israel refuses to connect your unrecognized village to national electricity or water grids or provide basic services like paved roads, sewage systems, and schools. Right. Next one, can I stay here for years to come? On Neret's side, yes. Israel continues to make more and more land available to Jewish communities to encourage you to stay and raise your family here. On Wissam's side, maybe not. Right? Israel seeks to concentrate Bedouins in government-planned townships. As a resident of an unrecognized village, you live under constant threat of home demolition. Right? Even though you're a citizen, you are not recognized as such. If you want to move, do you have a lot of options? On Neret's side, yes, you can move virtually anywhere. Right? On Wissam's side, maybe not. Among other challenges, hundreds of small Jewish towns have admissions committees that have the power by law to exclude Palestinian citizens from living there, right? By law. You can see more information on the IMEU website, which is linked. So then we get to Palestinians in the West Bank, right? The previous slide was about Palestinians who are citizens of the state of Israel, meaning that in our ideas of citizenship, you're entitled to the same rights and privileges as anyone else, right? Now let's go into Palestinians in the West Bank who are not citizens of the state of Israel, right? They are considered Palestinians and they are in the occupied territories. So we have Ilan, a Jewish citizen of Israel, born in an Israeli settlement in the West Bank. And then we have Miriam, a Palestinian ID holder, born in a Palestinian village, Area C. Now, the designations for the different types of areas we'll talk about or I'll show you a video on later. All right, so can I hop in my car and drive to Jerusalem? On one side, yes. On the other side, no. This is predictably repetitive, right? If I'm arrested, will I get a fair trial? On one side, yes. On the other side, no. In fact, Palestinians are not subjected to civilian trials. They are automatically, regardless of the infraction, sent to a military trial, a military court. Right. And they can often be imprisoned without trial, and even if they have a trial, with secret evidence. Do I have the right to free speech and the right to protest? Yes. Only speech with near certainty to seriously jeopardize vital security can be restricted. You can protest without fear of state repression on one side. Now, I would personally challenge this because there have been many cases of Israeli citizens trying to protest and not being treated well by their own government, right? On the other side, obviously no for Miriam. Military orders restrict your right to free speech and right to protest. If you violate these vaguely worded orders, you could face up to 10 years in prison. Can I build a home? On one side, yes, doesn't matter where. On the other side, no. Because you live in the 60% of the West Bank that is under exclusive Israeli control, Area C, it's virtually impossible. You may be more likely to have your home demolished than get a permit to build. Okay. So, international law views the West Bank as Palestinian territory, but it is controlled by the Israeli military. Palestinians are forcibly removed from their homes or are made to demolish those homes to make room for illegal Israeli settlements, right? They're building on land that they are not entitled to. And then all Palestinians, including children, are tried in military courts for any offense. Right. Now let's look at another situation. This is a Jewish citizen of Israel born in East Jerusalem. The rules for Jerusalem are very similar to the West Bank, which is why they're paired together here on this slide, right? So we have Noah, and then we have Zaid, who is a Palestinian resident born in East Jerusalem, right? Is my legal status in Jerusalem secure? On the one side, yes. On the other side, no. Can I move abroad for a few years and come back? On the one side, yes. On the other side, maybe not. For any of you who have Palestinian friends who lived in Palestine, and then maybe left home to study abroad, whether to get a college degree or something. If you've talked to those friends, you know how hard that decision is to make, because there's no guarantee that you can ever go back. Right? Can I easily move to a new home in East Jerusalem? Yes, on one side, maybe not on the other, because remember, legally, Jewish citizens of Israel are allowed to prevent certain people from living in their neighborhoods, even in occupied territory. Right? It is also impossible to obtain a building permit, and a lot of Palestinian areas are already overcrowded as it is. So the last section is Gaza, and this is also known as the world's largest open air prison. Now, there's so much about Gaza that I think the best way to explain it is just to share this video with you from Al Jazeera. I'm going to just check and make sure that I am sharing sound. Again, if it's too loud, just be prepared with your, what's it called? Volume. I'm also going to put everyone on mute so that there's no feedback.
What's life like inside the world's biggest prison? To find out, you don't have to commit any crime, you just have to be born in Gaza. This tiny strip of flat, open Palestinian land, about 25 miles long and only 7 miles wide at its widest point, is surrounded by Egypt and the Mediterranean Sea to the south and west, and Israel, which has closed Gaza off to the outside world since the early 90s. Like many prisons, Gaza is overcrowded. In 2021, the population grew to over 2 million, with one of the highest population densities in the world, triple that of Detroit, which is about the same size. But where did all these people come from? Well, about 70% of Gazans are refugees and their descendants. They were forced to move there when Israel took over their towns and villages around the time it was founded in 1948. Many fled, thinking they were temporarily getting to safety. But Israel has never allowed them to go back, despite many of these towns and villages being a short drive or walking distance from Gaza. Israel actually went on to occupy Gaza in 1967, imposed military rule on the people who lived there, and gave part of its territory to Israeli settlers. In the early 90s, it imposed a closure policy on Gaza. Palestinians there could no longer leave without a time-restricted, hard-to-get permit, and Palestinians from other areas were restricted from visiting Gaza as well. But it was in 2006 when things got really bad. Israel had pulled its soldiers and settlers out of Gaza the year before, while still controlling the borders, the airspace, and the economy. The Palestinian group Hamas, which has a military wing that fights the Israeli occupation, won Palestinian elections and took over Gaza. In response, Israel took its policies to the next level. The only power plant was bombed. Travel was banned. Most imports and exports were blocked, forcing most of Gaza's factories to shut down. Fishermen couldn't fish beyond a very limited area. Supplies of fuel and electricity were reduced so much that people converted their cars to run on cooking oil. Even medical supplies were restricted. The Israeli government decided how much food would be let in by calculating how many calories everyone in Gaza would get. As a government advisor at the time said, the idea is to put the Palestinians on a diet, but not make them die of hunger. These policies crushed Gaza's economy. It now has the highest unemployment rate in the world, and more than half the people live under the poverty line. Even materials to build infrastructure like sewage treatment plants have been held back, so raw sewage is pumped into the sea. In 2012, the United Nations said that if things didn't get better, Gaza would be unlivable by 2020. Instead, things got even worse. There have been several major military assaults by Israel on Gaza. Israel says the goal of these assaults is to limit Hamas's ability to fight. Thousands of civilians have been killed, and tens of thousands of homes destroyed in these assaults. Israeli officials call it mowing the lawn. But even when the assaults stop, supplies to rebuild are often prevented by Israel from entering the territory. Meanwhile, the Egyptian government is a close ally of the Israeli government and has long helped maintain the siege. Its border with Gaza has often been closed as well. When the border does open, only a few hundred people are allowed in or out. For a while, Gazans built a tunnel economy under that border, smuggling in everything from urgently needed supplies to weapons to even fast food from Egypt. But the Egyptian government eventually flooded many of the tunnels and even destroyed one of its own border towns to cut off these supplies. About half of Gaza's population are children, meaning they've only ever known life under this blockade. They've never known a full day with electricity. They know when the bombing starts, there's nowhere for them to flee. They know that when they get older, they're probably not going to find work. They likely will not be able to leave Gaza or even meet Palestinians from other parts of their country. They know what it's like living in the world's biggest prison.
So there are a couple of things that I want to point out in terms of this video that were sort of glossed over, because again, there's just so much information. But you may have noticed one of the things that was mentioned was medical supplies often cannot get into Palestine, into the Gaza Strip specifically. I want you to think about this past year in which we've been in a pandemic and how vital vaccines are to combating this pandemic. When I first did this, so up until basically the war that happened just recently in May, Israel was not allowing vaccines to go into Palestine, into the Gaza Strip specifically. More recently, I believe last week, they allowed vaccines to go in, but most of those vaccines were either expired or nearly expired, meaning that they were useless. This was at the same time that the world was touting Israel's very efficient vaccination program. And yes, it was efficient if you were a Jewish citizen of Israel. Remember those discrepancies and those disparities. Another thing that was mentioned was sort of the blockading of any imports in general. I do want to point you to this. Okay, there we go. This graph, which is from the Carter Center, it was formed in 2000, or the graph was made in 2008. At this point, some might ask, well, what about the rockets? Well, this graph will show you that the rate of the imports of goods into Gaza and the rate of rockets and mortars fired from Gaza into Israel. Right, so as you can see, as the total imports drop, rocket fire goes up. Why would that be the case? What are some thoughts? Okay, I see fighting for their lives. Obviously, they have nothing. Is that it? Are there any other thoughts about why the rockets would go up when their supplies in terms of livelihood are down? Or does that basically fit what everyone else's ideas are? Of course, this is a small sample, right? We're just a small group of people here. Who knows? When I post this to YouTube, maybe there'll be a ton of comments. Tons. All right, so let's go on to some more parts of the official policy. Let's talk about checkpoints. Now, checkpoints exist all over the West Bank in areas of Israel, and when Israel was inside the Gaza Strip, there were checkpoints there as well, as you could see in the pictures, or in the video where they showed some pictures of them. So in addition to controlling the food and water supplies of Palestinians, Israel restricts Palestinian movement and development. Checkpoints and Jewish-only roads segregate the Palestinians from Israelis and other Palestinians. In some cases, even going to a nearby neighborhood can take hours because of the wait in the checkpoints. In 2005, 61 women gave birth while waiting at a checkpoint, and 36 of those babies died as a result because they were nowhere near a hospital that could take care of them, right? Israel claims the checkpoints are essential to preventing attacks of terrorism, right, or acts of terrorism by Palestinians, and that checkpoints will be removed as the terrorist threat decreases. This is a source from this one website called Stand With Us, which is a pro-Zionist, pro-Israel website. However, Studies from 2015 have shown that removing the checkpoints actually increases Palestinian willingness to negotiate a peace and reduces danger for Israel. The source there is NPR. For a typical look at the work commute for a Palestinian through these checkpoints, I would highly recommend the interactive article from the Washington Post that's linked there, and also the movie The Present, which is on Netflix and is linked on the slide as well. Right. So that's what we have in terms of checkpoints. So that's one piece of official policy. Remember, these are things that are openly stated. We know that they're happening and the Israeli government is not hiding it. The next one is settlements, also open, right? So while the West Bank is considered Palestinian territory, internationally, Israel has been expanding into the Palestinian territory through the building of illegal settlements, right? Under international law, these are all illegal settlements because they are on Palestinian land as designated by UN resolutions and the international understanding, right? However, that has not prevented Israel from moving in to these areas and creating settlements and allowing people to live there. So for more, you can see the Facts on the Ground app that is by Americans for Peace Now. That app tracks the creation of illegal Israeli settlements in real time. So you can see where it's happening day to day. And I'm not exaggerating when I say day to day. Right. So does Israel encourage settlements? The short answer is yes. From birthright trips to guaranteed housing, funding, police and military support, Israel seeks to recruit more people to take up land that, by international recognition, belongs to Palestine and Palestinians. If Israel is theirs by the command of God, the logical extension is that they should have all of it. The settlements are made to ensure an Israeli demographic majority, as the principle of Zionism dictates, in occupied territories. Remember that demographic majority is key. You cannot have, according to Zionism, a safe Jewish state if it does not have a demographic majority. Right. You can also see a video that's linked from B'Tselem, which is a Jewish organization within Israel that is against the occupation. All right, so official policy in summary. What do we think the official policy is, just based on what you've seen so far? You can drop it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself if you'd like. Oh, okay, it looks like I cut off. You can unmute yourself. Sorry, I only muted some people because I didn't want there to be reverb from the video that was played, right? So I want to ask, what do you think, based on what you've seen so far, is the official policy, right? What word would you use to describe a system in which there is segregation, there are checkpoints, there is the valuing of one group over another, inequality in terms of rights? What would you call that system?
Apartheid.
There we go. There's the magic answer. Official policy in summary is basically apartheid, an international human rights violation that consists of three parts: an intent to maintain the domination of one racial group over another, systematic oppression by one racial group over another, and one or more inhumane acts as part of that oppression. And we'll get into that last part a little more. Now, this is sourced from the Human Rights Watch. There have also been other organizations such as Amnesty International that have documented for years the apartheid system in Israel. And in fact, when we think of apartheid, right, we think of South Africa. Well, many of the leaders of the South African movement to get rid of apartheid are also staunch supporters of Palestine for these reasons, for the similarities in those systems. Right. So that's official policy. This is what is on the books based on their laws that discriminate against a certain group and provide more access and better treatment to another group. So let's talk about unofficial policy. beyond the books, right? So while Israel's official policies and acts have been known and reported on extensively around the world, social media has enabled more people to see what life under Israeli occupation is really like. From settler lynch mobs to Israeli occupational forces attacking people in their homes. And I do call them the occupational forces because it is not defensive when you're attacking people, right? To the general dehumanization of Palestinians, right? So we can talk about this in terms of war crimes, right? Israel has been criticized in the past for their war crimes, including the use of white phosphorus and the targeting of civilians. The targeting of civilians is explained by the excuse that Hamas is using human shields. However, deliberate targets in battles have ranged from a UN-run school, hospitals, power plants, and in the most recent war, a building that housed major international news outlets such as the Associated Press, and the only coronavirus testing center in Gaza in the middle of a pandemic in which they have not been allowed to have any vaccines. To date, there has been no evidence of any of these sites being used by Hamas. In fact, it was so ludicrous that The Onion recently posted this. The Onion calls on Israel to bomb our offices in case any Hamas agents hiding out there, right? The full article is linked for anyone who's interested, right? But this is not uncommon. This is not something that is only relegated to the most recent fighting, right? This is something that happens almost every time. The UN-run school that I'm specifically referring to is from the targeting of a UN school under Operation Cast Lead, which was in 2008, 2009, right? So this is a pattern. Also, when peace no longer means peace. Now, this is again another place where there's going to be a loud volume in this video, so I'm going to ask everyone to please mute themselves so that there's no reverberation. But this is basically about what happens in between, right? The wars make international headlines, but once a ceasefire is called, are there any discernible changes for the Palestinians under Israeli occupation? Aside from my slide on war crimes, every single thing that we've talked about so far is what it's like during peacetime, when there is no overt fighting. Okay. So I'm going to mute myself and play. Okay, so you can learn more about this from reading an article that I've linked here from Vox. But I want you to think about that video and I want you to think, does that look like peacetime to you? Is that what we expect when we think of what peaceful living would be in a time of peace where there is no war, there is no battle, there is no overt fighting? Because this is daily life. This is not the exception, this is the rule. Sorry about that. So what is the rule? We basically have forced expulsions, extrajudicial killings, military courts, which is also part of the official policy if we think about it, checkpoints and travel restrictions that are part of the official policy, but are also enforced in ways that are not necessarily by the book, whatever the book says, and then general discrimination, right? These are the daily realities for Palestinians, whether they are citizens of Israel or whether they're in the occupied territories. Okay, so, oops, okay. Unofficial policy, in summary, what do we think the unofficial policy is if we have forced expulsions, if we have extrajudicial killings, if we have unequal rights, and we have also unfair court systems and laws? What would we call this? What is the purpose of all of these things? What do we gain if that's the policy we're going by? Any guesses, any thoughts? Feel free to unmute yourself or you can use the chat. So it looks like I got cut off again. So the question is, what do we gain from this unofficial policy? What is the end? What is the point of it? If we're forcibly removing people who we decide are undesirable in these places and we're persecuting them, I see someone has typed elimination of the other. I see genocide, right? Now, I personally am fine with the use of the word genocide. In terms of the actual legal definition, what we have is ethnic cleansing. The mass expulsion or killing of members of an unwanted ethnic or religious group in a society, right? So again, elimination of the other, genocide, right? These, I believe, fall under ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing itself is a legal distinction. All right, so also one of the interesting things is this fits in quite well to the third point of apartheid, which is one or more inhumane acts as part of that oppression, right? Extrajudicial killings, forced expulsions, these are considered under international law as inhumane acts, right? So what we're going to go into now is current news. We've just finished the section on history. Before we go on, I want to check in and see if there are any questions from anybody. If you have a question, you can go ahead and type it in the chat or unmute yourself before we go into today, right? Obviously, you can see how everything we've talked about has led up to what we're about to talk about today and how it is continually the lives that Palestinians face. Looks like there are no questions. Okay, looks like we're good to go. So, as always, I love to start these sections with some poetry. This is from one of my personal favorite poets, Suhair Hamed, and this is from her poem, Gaza. Some must die because they are the vicinity. Some must die because it was written. No army does not apologize, has never apologized. Authority chases paper, assembly, occupation settles deeper. So let's talk about what's happening and why Palestine and Israel are in the news and why there seems to be much more vocal objections than there has been in the past, because we are in a different age. So let's start with what is happening in Sheikh Jarrah. Right, this source is Middle East Eye for this video. Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood in East Jerusalem and home to 3,000 Palestinians who fled to Jerusalem during the Nakba. An agreement in 1956 was supposed to grant ownership titles to their homes, but that never happened because in 1967, Israel occupied East Jerusalem. In October 2020, an Israeli court ordered the forcible eviction of 12 Palestinian families. This ruling also threatens 550 Palestinians of falling to the same fate. When residents started peacefully protesting, they were met with police and settler violence. Right? So remember, this is happening in East Jerusalem, which is legally under international law, Palestinian territory. But Israel is promoting the building of illegal settlements there. Now, this video you may all have seen. I'm going to, again, ask for everyone to mute so if there's no echo or reverberation, but this is basically the first instance recently that got more people talking. You've probably seen this.
Jacob, you know this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? Why are you yelling at me? I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
But
It's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
You are stealing my house.
And if I don't steal it, someone else is going to steal it.
Okay, so as I said before, this is what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah right now. What I want to, the reason I bring this up is because you can't understand the violence that erupted in May without knowing about this point, right? The fighting didn't just come out of nowhere. There was a buildup, there was aggression, there was agitation. So in this case, Sheikh Jarrah, the people there were basically peacefully, for the most part, protesting the decision to basically kick them out of their homes or demolish them, right? Now, I wonder if anyone, when this specific settler, who there's a lot of interesting information about that's linked on the slide, but when he said, if I don't steal it, somebody else will, did that remind anyone of any other quotes that we may have had earlier in the presentation? It's been long, so I understand if it doesn't come to mind, but this was in the history section. Trying to recall, I see in the chat. Right, so there we go. Zui has it. Nature abhors a vacuum. Remember, Mark Sykes said, if the Zionists don't go to Palestine, then somebody else will. The logic is virtually the same. It has not changed when we break it down, right? So let's just dismiss the fact that there were people who were living there for centuries, I guess. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about what happened in May. So as this was unfolding, right, in response to the forcible evictions and police brutality enacted upon Palestinians in East Jerusalem, Hamas fired rockets into Israel. And Israel responded by bombarding Gaza. After 11 days of fighting, a ceasefire was called. Now, some people might think, well, why did Hamas have to get involved, right? It wasn't happening to them. They're in the Gaza Strip, right? Remember that Hamas considers itself a political party in the state of Palestine. The ultimate goal is that there will be a state of Palestine, and part of that state is East Jerusalem, part of that state is the West Bank, part of that state is the Gaza Strip. So if you attack one of those parts, that's a declaration of war in their eyes, right? So after 11 days of fighting, a ceasefire was called. The total number of deaths in Israel were 13. In Gaza, it was 200, right? The 13 in Israel included, I believe, 2 children, and the deaths in Gaza included about 75 children at the time of this presentation was made. I believe that the numbers are changing as we speak. Right. So this is an infographic from the IMEU on the Palestinian children Israel killed in May. Obviously, at the time it said so far, because again, as they go through the rubble, we're going to get more numbers, most likely. And I want you to look at all these faces. These are the 75 plus children who were killed in May in a period of 11 days. Now, it's important to look at these faces, not just to humanize the people who are affected by this violence and by the system, but also because there's a specific way that it is talked about, especially in Western media, that is led specifically by Israel and their propaganda strategies, right? For many of these children, we don't even have pictures of them. Okay, you can see that they range in age from newborns to 18, 19 years old children. 200 deaths total, 75 of them children. Here is a screenshot from the official Israeli Defense Forces Twitter. The IDF has successfully completed Operation Guardian of the Walls. This is what the 12-day-long operation looked like in numbers. 4,360 plus rockets fired at Israel. 90% of those rockets were intercepted by the Iron Dome. 13 people killed in Israel. 680 Hamas rockets misfired in Gaza, meaning that they never made it to Israel. 1,500 plus terror targets struck in Gaza. 675 rockets launching capabilities damaged. I'm going to go to the last part. 60 plus miles of Hamas terror tunnel networks destroyed. And then the last thing that I want to point out is 200 plus terrorists neutralized. If the total death count at that time was 200 deaths, and that included 75 children, how are they presenting it to the world? Tell me how a newborn or a 1-year-old is a terrorist that has been neutralized. And this tweet, last I checked, it's still up. So you can just go onto Twitter and go to their account and you'll see it, this graph, right? One thing that for those of you who are graphic designers or understand graphics, this was actually pointed out to me by my sister-in-law. But notice the placement, right? 13 people is given much more room than 200 plus. Now, I'm not going to say that those 13 people don't deserve to also be recognized and mourned. That's not what I'm saying. But there is a specific use of basically implicit propaganda here, right? They're not going to point out the fact that, oh, look, we made 13 people look much bigger than 200 plus people. Also, we named those people terrorists, even though we don't have any evidence to say that they are or were not terrorists, right? And again, I'm going to ask, how do you prove that a newborn or a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or even a 10, 11, 12-year-old is a terrorist?
There is no proof. It's literally just propaganda. They want to show the world that they are doing this by the book or that they have full reason to bomb or do whatever. This is clearly just dehumanizing, or it's absolutely horrific. The fact that this is allowed to even happen.
Yeah, I mean, I will say when I saw that, and the reason I have the screenshot is because I saw that in real time. I saw it when they posted it and I went, you've got to be kidding me. Right? For anyone who's following what was happening in May, right? As soon as you see that 200 number, you know exactly who they're referring to. If you know the death count and you know what they're counting as terrorist neutralized and you know who is part of that death count, you know exactly what they were trying to communicate. So let's talk about what started happening just, I believe, yesterday or the day before. What is happening in Ceylon? There's a ceasefire now, right? Technically, we are back in peacetime. So what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah was happening during peacetime. It led to the conflict in May, which I guess we can call another war, although war is pretty lopsided here. And then we're in a ceasefire. We're technically in peacetime. So what's happening in Ceylon? Since the ceasefire was established, Israel continued its policy of ethnically cleansing Palestinians from areas of Jerusalem and the West Bank. These plans have been in place since 2005. Recently, Israel has ordered the forcible demolition of Palestinian homes, displacing 1,500 Palestinians in the occupied West Bank to create an Israeli theme park and have some undeveloped land, meaning just land that they're going to let grow wild. And in the process of doing that, in the process of creating a theme park and having undeveloped land, they are going to displace 1,500 Palestinians on territory that Israel has no legal right to. And that is happening now, and that is happening in peacetime. So in all honesty, I'm just wondering how long this ceasefire is going to last. I wouldn't be surprised if it gets broken pretty soon. And I guess you'll have to decide for yourself who's to blame for breaking the ceasefire. All right, so back to the question that I had asked earlier. What kind of life are you willing to accept for yourself? You have seen what daily life in peacetime and in wartime is like for Palestinians who are either citizens of the state of Israel or who are just their hostages. That is their life. Are you willing to accept it for yourself? Are you willing
This
to
is
live
not
like
life. It's not life. The word life doesn't even apply to this situation. What they are, they're basically existing, if you want to even call it that. They're in a state of limbo that's not being, there's no help for them from anyone, which is, I'm sorry if I'm just, it's just ridiculous. Just to see this, and everyone can see this for themselves. Anyone with half a brain cell could literally just research just 1 second, and they see these people living quotation like this, and they think it's destroying a places for a theme park. This is like a dystopian novel brought to life. It's insane. It really is. No, obviously I would not accept this for myself. I wouldn't accept this on anyone, let alone these individuals. It's ridiculous. Absolutely horrendous.
And I love that you said that you wouldn't accept it for anyone, Buli, because that is exactly my next question. If you are unwilling to accept a life like this for yourself, why are you, and I'm not saying anyone, but why would people be willing to accept that for others? And that's really a moral question that every individual really has to ask themselves. If I wouldn't accept this for myself, if I wouldn't want to live this way, why am I content knowing that there are people in the world who do? And if I have the power to do something about it, why do I choose not to? Okay. So we're going to have a short intermission. I'm actually going to pause the recording and give people a chance to get up and stretch. We'll do a 5-minute break if that sounds good to everyone. It's been about an hour and 40 minutes that we've been going through this. There's a whole second half. So I'm going to go ahead and pause. Right, and I will see you all in 5 minutes. The recording is paused, so if you want to chat during, feel free. I'm going to be here for the 5 minutes. I might grab some water though.
Probably gonna go get some water too, so I'll be back in like a bit.
Yeah.
It is now recording.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we are out of intermission. Hopefully some of you got a chance to read this poem from Fadi Judah, which is Mimesis. I love the poem. I think that it simplifies things down to a very understandable level, right? Refugees are not born, they are made. So let's go into the next part, perceptions. Now, this is a very long quote from Isaac Asimov, who's one of my favorite writers and a big sci-fi geek. And one of the things I learned as I was doing research and preparing for this presentation is that evidently Asimov was not too thrilled with the idea of the state of Israel as a Jewish person himself. Right? So I'm frequently asked if I have visited Israel, whereas yet it is simply assumed that I have. Well, I don't travel. I really don't. And if I did, I probably wouldn't visit Israel. I remember how it was in 1948 when Israel was being established and all my Jewish friends were ecstatic. I was not. I said, what are we doing? We are establishing ourselves in a ghetto in a small corner of a vast Muslim sea. The Muslims will never forget nor forgive, and Israel, as long as it exists, will be embattled. I was laughed at, but I was right. I can't help but feel that the Jews didn't really have to have the right to appropriate a territory only because 2,000 years ago, people they consider their ancestors were living there. history moves on and you can't really turn it back. So, points to Asimov. But this section is really, it's called perceptions, and this is going to be a little more interactive. Basically, what's going to happen is I am going to, sorry, I lost my, there we go. All right, I'm going to basically show you a statement, and I'm going to ask you to maybe think of, based on the knowledge that you have now, what your response might be to these statements, right? Again, this is based on perceptions. Right. So the first one is, but it's the only democracy in the Middle East, right? In order to defend the state of Israel, this is one of the main things that is mentioned. What would be your response? Knowing what you know now about the state of Israel, how would you respond to the statement?
Can you really call it a democracy?
Sorry.
What is exactly the definition of a democracy itself? Like, I'm not going to claim I know much about specifics and definitions for that. I'm not really that political, but I'm pretty sure democracy implies some sort of fairness in certain aspects of voting and stuff. So would you really call Israel democratic if it doesn't even allow a huge portion of its residents even the ability to vote? How would that even work?
Interesting point. How many of you agree with that Israel cannot be considered a democracy because it does not afford equal rights to all of its citizens? Okay, I see a hand. Melissa, did you want to say something, or are you just raising your hand?
No, I agree. If you can't consider a large portion of your residents as citizens, then the fact that all your citizenry can vote is kind of a moot point in democracy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I see in the comments, not a fair democracy. All right, so this is, there are like two answers to this. There's one answer that Melissa and Bully were both talking about, which is it really a democracy if only some of your citizens can actually vote or have full rights and due process in that democracy? So that's one answer, that's one rebuttal to this statement. And that would really force whoever the person is speaking to really analyze, what do they know about this democracy? What do they know about life in Israel? What do they know about the different rights that are afforded to different people, right? So my personal answer, the thing I like to say and point out, is this. Pop quiz: which of these societies were democracies? Ancient Athens in the 5th century BCE, the United States in 1780, South Africa in 1980. D, all of the above.
I want to say Athens was Greece. I don't know. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, you're right. Athens was the birthplace of democracy. I see in all of the above. Yes, all of the above. All of these places were democracies, but keep in mind, a democracy is not a set of values. A democracy is a system of governance. And I think that the sort of, especially in the war, the run up to the war on terror, this sort of fetishization of, I screwed up that word, fetishization of, you know what I'm saying, of democracy has really sort of made this view of democracy that doesn't really exist, right? Ancient Athens, the birthplace of democracy as we know it, had slaves. Slavery was a regular part of Athenian life, right? The United States in 1780 had slavery, had slaves, were ethnically cleansing and committing genocide against the native peoples, the indigenous peoples of this land, right? South Africa in 1980 was an apartheid state. It was still considered a democracy, right? So the answer is all of the above. All of these were democracies while at the same time committing violent acts against people and dehumanizing them. So really this idea that democracy somehow makes them better, I mean, it's a form of government. Would we feel the same way about Israel if they happen to be a dictatorship doing these same things? Right? So that's my personal response. Of course, there are many responses, but this is just one of them. I think that part of the combating the misinformation in terms of how Israel's perceived, especially in the West, is sort of challenging those notions. Like, if you're going to call it a democratic state, what do you mean by democratic state? And if you're still going to call it a democratic state, does democracy matter if it's still going to open up all of these violations of human rights, as it has historically? Right? Those are things to ask. A lot of these questions, the reason the issue of Palestine is so hard is not because the actual issue is hard, but because what it makes us think about is hard. Right? We have to answer a lot of questions about where we stand individually on moral issues when faced with Palestine. So this next one is, but anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. What would be the response here?
Just no. No. They're two different things. I'm sorry. They're literally not the same thing.
Why are they not?
One is referring to Semites, and others are basically it's like a belief system of sorts. It's like they're two different things. It's like saying someone's anti-Arab, for example, but he specifically means like Muslims. They're not the same. You can have Arab Christians, for example, but the word is used to imply something else. It doesn't work, I think.
Okay, how many of you agree with that or have things to add? What would you say if someone came up to you and said, well, if you're anti-Zionist, that means you're anti-Semitic? I see in the comments, you can be against extremism without being against a group of people. How many of you, a show of hands or a thumbs up? That seems like a fair statement, right? We can be against extremism without being against a group of people. So here are some answers to this, right? First of all, to say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism is to completely erase the historic movement of anti-Zionist Jewish organizations and religious movements, which have been around basically since Zionism has been around, right? So are you going to call these Jewish organizations anti-Semitic? That seems odd. But that is the case. Many anti-Zionist Jewish organizations are charged with being full of self-hating Jews who play into the hands of the enemies of the Jewish people. Right? There can't be any reason for you to be anti-Zionist if you are a Jewish person. Part of the rule of Zionism, and actually there was a quote that I included in the presentation, but then I got rid of it. It was a Chaim Weizmann quote. But basically, the idea for Zionism is that eventually Zionism and Judaism will be synonymous. Early founders of Zionism said that exact same thing. Chaim Weizmann said, was the quote that I was thinking about. Oh yeah, the idea that the creation of the state of Israel would then get rid of all these assimilated Jews who he looked down upon and create sort of what he called a 100% Jew. He had a very clear idea of what it meant to be Jewish, and there were no other room for interpretation. And Zionism still to this day holds that. If you look at a lot of the writers about Zionism, even early Zionists like Hannah Arendt, who we know for the quote, the banality of evil in terms of the Eichmann trial, she herself was a Zionist, but her idea was sort of a different form of Zionism that fell out, right? The idea was a Jewish homeland, but with the Arabs. It would just be one state, everyone together, democracy, hooray. Obviously, that point of view lost in terms of the battles of history. That form of Zionism did not gain much traction. But when we look at how we see it today, right, it's a benefit for Zionism to conflate and bring all Jewish people under that umbrella. It is the same benefit that Western powers have when they try to conflate all Muslims under the extremists in their world, all Hindus under the extremists in their world, right? Any time that you want to reduce somebody to the extremists in their society, you're basically saying that they are one and the same. And for me as a Muslim, one of the things that I thought was very aggravating, actually, especially growing up, was on one hand, I had all these like liberal Western democracies saying like, oh, look how bad the Muslims are. Look at ISIS. That's what Islam is really like. And then on the other side, we have Al Qaeda and ISIS, and like, yeah, this is what Islam is like. We agree. You know, kiss. Like, what does that doesn't leave much room for Muslims like myself who do not in any way, shape, or form have any support for ISIS or Al Qaeda. But at the same time, do not want to side with these people and say, yeah, this is what Islam is, because that's not Islam to me. And that's not Islam to a majority of Muslims. Well, the same thing is happening now to Jewish people. You cannot conflate Judaism with Zionism. Zionism is a political movement. Judaism is a belief, a religious belief that is sincerely held by many people. It is also considered an ethnicity by many people. And those are things that don't necessarily lend themselves to extremism, just like Islam in itself doesn't necessarily lend itself to extremism. There are people within those groups who would like to take it farther. There are people within those groups who are bad faith actors, right? But we don't give in to those bad faith actors by saying, yes, these are one and the same. They're exactly alike. Every Jewish person is a Zionist, and every Zionist is a Jewish person, which, if you remember the little brief discussion on Christian Zionism at the beginning, not every Zionist is a Jewish person, in fact. So here are some reasons that Jewish people have put forward for opposing the state of Israel and Zionism in general. Now, it's not to say that every Jewish person believes in each of these things. It's just these are some of the reasons that come up when you listen in on the really robust conversations within Judaism, within the religion, within the ethnicity about the state of Israel. There are robust conversations happening there. They're just not reported, they're just not shared. Just in the same way that there were many robust conversations happening in the Islamic world that nobody ever wanted to share because it didn't fit this image of here are the terrorists, right? So some reasons. One reason is a religious argument. A lot of conservative Jewish people hold this from a certain sect, that the Jewish people broke their covenant with God and therefore must live in exile as punishment. So in order to create the state of Israel, you're basically denying God's punishment. That's a religious reason for some people who are anti-Zionist. A political argument is that Zionism only perpetuates anti-Semitism by confirming the view that Jewish people are permanent aliens wherever they reside. Right? Part of the reason Zionism was so popular, especially in its earlier days in the British Empire, was because Britain didn't want Jewish people to come to their land. So if we can ship them off somewhere else, hooray, two birds, one stone, right? It was supported by their own anti-Semitism. In fact, Arthur Balfour, I think I skipped over this on the slide, but shortly before Chaim Weizmann and him met and established a relationship, Balfour had successfully prevented the immigration of Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe into Britain. Right, so Chaim Weizmann was partnering with a very well-known anti-Semite. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, when historically Zionists have themselves worked with anti-Semites. So the last thing I'll note is an ethical argument that the practices of Zionism enacted by the state of Israel are abhorrent and violate human rights. So even if you don't have an opinion on Zionism as a political ideology in the abstract, the practical application of it is abhorrent because of what they're doing to the Palestinian people. So those are three very general reasons that Jewish people themselves may be anti-Zionist. there are more than that. There's very robust organizations, B'Tselem, Jewish Forces for Peace, right? So many organizations where this conversation is happening, but the rest of the world doesn't seem to be tapped into it. And therefore, it's easier for Zionists and for the Israeli state to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, right? So it's also not helped by the fact that there are people who within the anti-Zionist movement who are anti-Semitic. But if you look at the actual, like the movement, the leaders and stuff, a lot of them are not. A lot of them condemn anti-Semitism. Those things go hand in hand. And oftentimes the discussion of anti-Semitism is really just used to distract from the actual discussion of atrocities happening to Palestinians. Because if we're always so busy fighting and saying, no, this is not anti-Semitic, this is a political, program that is being objected to, then we're no longer talking about that actual political program that is happening. Right? That's a tactic. All right, so this next one, but Zionism was a movement for decolonization. This is a big one. Zionism is often looked at as a liberation movement and part of the decolonization of the post-World War II world. How many of you are scratching your heads right now on this one?
Yes.
What's the confusion here?
Colonize one land to, I don't even think you could say decolonize Europe, but is that the thought behind it?
So the thought behind it is that because Palestine originally belonged to Jewish people, they are liberating it from those who took it over and returning it to the rightful owners. So some questions to consider, right? Consider the origins of the Zionists and the British Mandate of Palestine. Where did they come from? Who did they ally with? And who did they fight against? Some answers, right? They came from Europe. They allied with the British to establish a Jewish homeland in land that the British did not legally own by any sense of how we see land today, right? They fought against the people in Palestine who were fighting for independence from the British. So if we're going to call them a movement for decolonization, who are the early Zionists in the British Mandate being colonized by? If it's a decolonization movement, there has to be a colonizer. Who is that colonizer?
Britain was the one who's colonizing it initially, wasn't it?
But were they fighting against the British initially? Or were the British supporting their...
The Ottomans?
Not the Ottomans, right? Because as once the British took over, Israel is really formed under the mandate of Palestine under the British, right?
Mm.
But there is no colonizer. That's the issue with this statement. If you're going to be a movement for decolonization, there needs to be a colonizer, and it needs to be clear who that colonizer is. We can name any other place in the world. South Africa, we know that the white South Africans who enacted apartheid, right? They were the ones that were the colonizers. You look at the United States of America, European settlers were the colonizers, and they were colonizing indigenous Americans and Black people who they forcibly moved and enslaved into this continent, right? Anytime we talk about colonization or decolonization, we know who the players are and we know their roles. But here, who's the colonizer? There is none. Right, again, but if we just go with sort of the base information that is allowed to be spread, right, the myths and misconceptions, then this sounds like a very reasonable statement. They're a movement for decolonization. They're liberating their land. But when you actually look at their history and think about, well, who were the colonizers, all of a sudden, the statement doesn't make sense anymore. Right. This one is a really hard one, and it is but the Holocaust. And I get this often whenever I talk about what's happening in Palestine and the creation of Israel, but the Holocaust comes up. Based on what you know about the history of Israel, how does the Holocaust factor in? What would you say to someone who says, but the Holocaust justifies what's happening in Palestine, in Israel today?
I want to say some things, but I think maybe there's some kind of local bias to this, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
But in a sense, the Holocaust does not justify anything in this case, because, yeah, sure, it was a horrible event, no doubt. But what's that got to do with the Palestinians or anything? It's not like they instigated or did it. So how does that work? It's like you're using something else, a reason for something completely different, right? Am I?
Well, you can't be mean to the Jews now, because otherwise you get called a Nazi because the Holocaust, and we all agree the Nazis were bad. I don't agree with that. Just like the world was mean to, I'm a Jew, so like the world was mean to us before, and now we get to do whatever, like they can do whatever they want. I don't agree with the Israeli government, by the way.
I think
that seems to be the rationale, right? Like we were bullied, and now you can't say anything to us.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So there are a few things that I want to point out in response to this, right? But the Holocaust, and again, I get this so often that it almost makes my head want to explode, right? First off, I want to state unequivocally, the Holocaust happened. I will not tolerate any Holocaust deniers in my life. The Holocaust happened, it was real, there is evidence for it, and it was despicable and horrible, and it is a stain on humanity. And I do say humanity, not just the Nazis, because the world knew what was going on according to historical records and would still turn away refugees. Palestine was one of the few places that actually took in refugees who were escaping the Holocaust. So that's why I consider it a stain on all of humanity. Anyone who had the ability to do something at the time and chose not to, that's a stain on them. All right. So the drive to form Israel, however, predates the Holocaust. Most of the significant promises were made during World War I and in the 1919 peace process. All right, the Holocaust did not happen yet at that point. So the Holocaust can't be used to retroactively justify something. Okay, that doesn't make sense timeline-wise. Also, one interesting thing I learned in my research that I did not know and was actually surprised to learn was Israel itself did not actually value Holocaust survivors when they first arrived. In fact, they were socially pressured to remain silent. They were often ridiculed, and they were seen as weak because they let the Nazis do that to them. If you want to see more, there's a really good Netflix documentary called The Devil Next Door, which is about the trial of the accused Nazi guard Don Demjanjuk. And also there's an article linked from the Washington Post. Okay, I was very surprised to hear that because I would assume that they would at least be given a place to process, if not a place of honor for what they went through, right? So this brings me to my last point, right? Bringing up the Holocaust as a justification for the ethnic cleansing and displacement of Palestinians is a non sequitur. It's a logical fallacy. It has no bearing on what Palestinians were subjected to. Why are we forcing Palestinians to pay for the Holocaust? Because if the Holocaust does factor in and it does play a part, and we do need to consider it in terms of the legitimacy of the state of Israel, that means we have to acknowledge that we are letting the Palestinians pay for the crimes of the Nazis. Now, some people at this point like to bring up like the Grand Mufti of Palestine, who is an interesting case because yes, he did collaborate with the Nazis. And some people even go as far as to say that he was the person who thought up the final solution, right? The actual mechanized killing in the Holocaust, which, if you know anything about Hitler, you knew that was coming anyway. He didn't need ideas from other people. He had all of them up there, and he had a good support team around him that were willing and happy to make it happen. Again, stain on humanity. So what the other thing that's underlying the sort of but the Holocaust thing is what Melissa pointed out, right? Just because you were brutalized doesn't give you the right to brutalize others. If that is the case, if we're saying that does justify these things, right, that needs to be made clear. This is, again, one of the difficulties about the situation in Palestine is that it forces us to really think about where we stand on certain issues. Do you believe that because someone was brutalized, they have the right to brutalize others? And how far and how are you willing to let this go? Does this apply only to nation states? Does this apply to cities and population, different groups within cities? Does this apply within a family, right? If someone is abused by their parents, does that give them the right to abuse their children in the future? Right? How far are we willing to go with this line of thinking? Again, that's something every individual is going to have to decide for themselves. All right, this next one. This one I might be a little snarky about, so I apologize in advance. But the Arabs should have just accepted the 1947 vote. They'd be better off today. This one I had to include because I heard this so much growing up, and I grew up in an Arab country where you're not even allowed to say the word Israel, and yet this was still the thinking, that the Palestinians were dumb and they should have just accepted the 1947 boundaries. What might you say to someone who says this?
This could apply to literally anything. It's like something bad, you might as well just accept it. Oh, you're raped, just accept it. No, that you don't accept something that's horrible or bad. You know, a bad thing is a bad thing. Just throwing it off as you should have just accepted it. None of this would have happened. This kind of thinking is completely wrong. When something bad happens, it's something you have to fight against, not accept it. Like, whoever said this is an idiot. Sorry, like, down.
Wooly, I'll tell you after who said this, and you're gonna laugh. All right, I see a comment. I think the international community are unwilling to say Israel is wrong for fear of being seen as aligned with Nazis or brutalizers, even though the US doesn't accept this behavior from other countries in our rhetoric. Yeah, that's a good point to make, right? Part of the fear of actually talking about this is the fear of being labeled anti-Semitic. There is a really, I mean, up until today, up until recently, it was almost unthinkable to have people speaking so vocally in the West about Palestine. Right? The Arab world, yeah, sure, people were talking without really doing anything. But in terms of in the West, right, it was sort of a given that the West was pro-Israel. Today, we're seeing a shift in that, in the dialogue, and I think we're at a threshold moment specifically. But here are some responses to this. First of all, knowing history, how much of the land did Palestinians of all faiths own or live on before 1947? Remember that video I showed you that showed the land breakups. So before 1947, how much of the land was Palestinian owned or Palestinian controlled?
I recall it was like almost all of it, wasn't it?
Yeah, almost all of it. I believe it was 97%.
And like 3%, yeah.
Yeah. How much land did the Jewish settlers live on before 1947? About 3% of that land. So does it make sense to give half of your land, half of your property to someone else just because they claim ownership? Would you give half of your home to somebody who just says, this is mine, I have the divine right to have this? Is that a good deal under any circumstances?
Worst deals in the history of deals right there.
Right. The issue here is that we're expecting Palestinians and Arabs generally to have inconceivable foresight, right? We're basically saying, like, you should have seen the future. You should have known this was coming and taken the deal. That makes no sense. Why would they, in that time period, in that moment, where they saw that things were still being negotiated and they had the majority of the land, and as far as they knew, they were still pretty secure with that land, why would they accept giving up half of it? Keep in mind, the Palestinians at the time were looking for a state, and part of that state would have included all of the Jewish people living there. They would have just become citizens of that state. So this is really a bad faith argument. You're either expecting Arabs to have incredible foresight, or you're basically justifying that some people need to just take what they can get and shut up about the injustice of it. This is my snarky slide. I couldn't help it, right? But when I hear people say the Arabs should have just accepted the 1947 vote, they'd be better off today. To me, it's like saying African Americans should have just accepted enslavement. Look at where they are now. The indigenous Americans should have just accepted the colonists. See all the technology we've brought them. India should have just accepted the British. Now they have trains, right? Like, it doesn't make sense. If you're going to basically retroactively justify everything based on the conditions that a person has today, right, then anything can be justified. Right. Specifically, the last one is always one that I am particularly tickled by, because it's just, as a Pakistani, as a person of South Asian descent, like, y'all, my ancestors were traversing that entire area well before there were trains. They did not need the trains. And to say that conquest is the only way that they could have ever gotten trains, like, couldn't the British have just sold them that technology, or partnered with them, or made some trade? Why did it have to be colonization to give them trains? Right. So to me, again, that's my snarky slide. It's just a ridiculous argument to me, because you cannot look at any other form of oppression in history and say that same thing with a straight face. I mean, there are people who still say these things, but I'd like to think culturally as a whole, we've recognized that that's a dumb argument. But who knows? Okay, so this one I'm not going to have anyone guess at, just because we haven't really talked about this aspect. There was a lot of the history that we skipped over. But generally I hear the Arabs want to exterminate Israel. I hear that often. Right, so this comes directly from the misinformation about the 1967 Six Days War. Right, the myth is that Israel had a preemptive attack to defend itself because all of the Arab neighbors were going to attack them. Now, from what we covered, you know that there was a steady escalation of tension, mostly pushed by aggression on the Israeli side, right? And so you can't really preemptively defend yourself from something you are causing. But that myth persists, right? So here's another thing to think about. If the Arabs really wanted to exterminate Israel, why was Israel able to have peace agreements with countries such as Jordan and Egypt very early on in their inception, right? Their deal with Jordan was in 1948, right? The reason that they didn't occupy the West Bank was because they had a deal with Jordan saying that Jordan would take over that land. Jordan would be in charge of it, right? So that's from the inception, right? Egypt very early on also made some deals, and deals to this day with Israel. Remember that that whole side of the border with Gaza is being enforced by Egypt. not by the Israelis, but by Egypt in conjunction with the deals that they've made with the Israelis. And then more recently, as part of Jared Kushner's Peace in the Middle East initiative, right? Saudi Arabia and the UAE have both normalized relations with the state of Israel. How does that fit in with the idea to exterminate it? There are so many Arab countries, there are so many Muslim countries, if we want to make this a religious argument, right? That if they wanted to exterminate the state of Israel, why haven't they done anything yet? Why didn't the 1967 Six Days War work out the way the myth says? Why didn't all of these countries just automatically just rise up one day and attack Israel, and then Israel fought itself, like defended itself? Doesn't make sense. And the truth is, right, Arabs see Israel as a European outpost, the last vestige of European colonization. The issue then often turns into Arabs want to exterminate the Jews. But that, again, doesn't make sense when historically anyone who knows about Jewish history knows that while things under Muslim empires weren't always great, there was still discrimination. They were generally 10 times better than what life was like in Europe for Jewish people. Right?
Even religiously, the whole concept of like Muslims hating Jews is completely false. Literally 100% false. If there's any Muslim out there who follows the book as it should be, it literally says they are one of the people of the book. That's it. You hate them, you're not following whatever you claim to be following.
Yeah. Well, personally, I stay away from religious arguments in terms of pure religion, just because I think that that's so open to interpretation. But I do like to talk about like sort of the political reality, right? And you're right. In Islam, the idea is that Jews, Christians, and Muslims, we are all praying to the same God. We are all people of the book, and therefore they are entitled to safety with us as Muslims, right? Again, historically speaking, that didn't always work out, right? The Ottomans did have their own version of pogroms back in the day. And there
Ottomans were shady as heck.
Yeah. But, there's historic significance to that. We know that there has been discrimination and anti-Semitism in the Muslim world, just as there was in Europe. The only difference is, I guess, a nature of degrees. The European one was just so horrible that Muslim anti-Semitism just pales in comparison, right? But that brings me to my next thing. But the Arabs expelled the Jews. This is always thrown out that, see, this is why the Arabs were always anti-Semitic, which is why they expelled all of their Jewish population. The weird thing, though, is if that were true, why did they only, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to open it up and see if anyone has any responses.
Expelling the Jews is an interesting one, considering I can say for a fact that Kuwait has had a Jew community, Iran has a Jewish community, Lebanon has a Jewish community, and some of them are still there. I mean, I don't recall any aspect of us actively expelling Jews as far as those three countries are concerned. And I'm Lebanese. I've actually seen these communities in Lebanon myself. So there's that side of it.
So part of the hard part of combating this is just that the history on this is so mixed. Because you're right, in certain places like in Kuwait, in Lebanon, in, I believe, even in Syria and stuff, they weren't really expelling Jewish people, but there are cases in some countries, such as Iraq, where they did. So this is really a matter of historical record. If you're going to conflate all Arabs as the same, which we're not, just make the mistake of confusing a Lebanese person with a Syrian person and just see the hell that breaks loose, right? We're not all the same, right? But if you conflate all of the Arabs as one people, all the same culture, right? Then you can easily say, well, if one Arab nation expelled them, that means all the Arab nations did. In reality, there were forced expulsions, often with violence, from some Arab countries such as Iraq and Iran. Leaders in those countries suspected their Jewish citizens of having another loyalty to Israel rather than their home countries. Right. So again, anti-Semitism in the Arab world existed, in the Muslim world existed, right? But those communities were still living in those countries for centuries, right? The Iraqi Jewish community is a very, very old community in Iraq. They are now mostly no longer there. I think it's down to 35 people, literally 35 people in one city, I think in Baghdad or something, right? But so there were forced expulsions that did happen, but we can't conflate that with all of the Arab states, right? Most of the other Arab countries did not forcibly push out their Jewish populations. Many Jewish people chose to leave voluntarily, either because they believed in the state of Israel as a place of safety for them, or because life became very difficult where they were living, thanks to rising anti-Semitism, thanks to the creation of the state of Israel. It's kind of a chicken or the egg thing. Okay, so Iraq is an interesting case, right? Because Iraq originally actually banned any of their Jewish people from leaving Iraq. They were not allowed to leave because they didn't want Jewish Iraqis to go and populate Israel, right? But then they changed their policy to allow immigration for about a year. They were like, okay, fine, you want to leave, you have a year. And then after that year, they started persecuting the Jewish population within their borders, which is why their numbers have dwindled down, right? So it's not a black and white issue in terms of the expulsions. Did it happen? Yes. Did it happen in every Arab country? No. Was it driven by anti-Semitism where it did happen? Yes, partly, right? A really great book that I always recommend to people about the expulsions and sort of the fate of Arab Jews in general is Rachel Shabi's book, We Look Like the Enemy. I love this book, not just because it's so informative, but also it's just really well written. As someone who is a writer and really doesn't like very academic and boring prose, like she weaves the story very well. So highly recommend that book. And the interesting thing about it is it's not just about sort of the expulsions, it's also about what happened to those people once they were kicked out of their original home and were forced to basically immigrate into Israel, and how Israel treated them. And that's a very interesting story, which we'll get into as we talk more about the Jewish state, which is our next slide, but it's the only Jewish state. This one again is going to be hard because in order to answer this, you need to know more specifics about the state of Israel and how it regards its Jewish populations, which we didn't really go into. But I want you to just think off the top of your head what you might say to this statement.
I'm just going to say something based on what I've heard from actual Jewish people say, where they don't think it's a Jewish state. They think it's like, like they say, oh, it's a Jewish state. No, it's not. They don't believe in the fact that it's a Jewish state. That's not me. That's from Jewish individuals saying that. But yeah, there's probably more to it than I probably know about this specific statement, but I'm just saying what I heard from those individuals.
Yeah, so you're right. There is, as we talked about when we talked about anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism, right? There are many Jewish people who, for various reasons, do not believe that Israel is a Jewish state and that it does not represent Judaism or Jewish people. But what are some other things that might come up? Again, this one's a little difficult because we did skip over quite a lot. When you imagine a Jewish person, I want you to think of that Jewish person, typical Jewish person in your mind. I want you to think of what they look like. How many of you immediately thought of a person with light skin? Just a show of hands. When you think of a typical Jewish person, how many of you thought of somebody with light skin or, more on the Middle Eastern or European looking? Okay, a couple of hands. How many of you thought of an African person or a person of African descent?
fairness to that statement, I do know that Ethiopian Jews and stuff exists.
Yes, but we don't think of them, right? And that's not by accident, right? Remember, Chaim Weizmann had a very specific viewpoint of what the 100% Jew would look like. And these attitudes were inflicted in their policy as well from early on. So who counts as Jewish in this Jewish state? If it is a Jewish state, right, you have to analyze who they count in those spaces, right? So Jewish immigration into Israel in its earliest days of statehood followed a racial hierarchy with European, otherwise known as Ashkenazi Jews at the top and Ethiopian Jews at the bottom. This was reflected in policies that allowed certain Jewish immigrants to be provided homes and work, regardless of when they arrived in the state, right? So that means that, and this is from Rachel Shabi's book, We Look Like the Enemy, right? Where she details the historical record of if you were an Arab Jew, if you were an Ethiopian Jew, and you came to Israel and you had to, at the time, all the immigrants had to live in a kibbutz for a while and work there until they were provided homes. Well, it didn't matter what time you arrived, because if a European Jew arrived after you, they would get preferential treatment. They would be moved ahead in the line, right? That's a clear, distinct racial hierarchy, right? And in fact, Israel still discriminates against Black Jews in particular, and have even enacted policies in the past, such as forced sterilization of Black Jewish immigrants. In many cases, women were not allowed, Jewish women, Ethiopian Jewish women were not allowed to enter the state of Israel without getting an inoculation. What they were not told was that this inoculation was basically a form of permanent birth control to reduce their numbers and reduce their birth count. So if this is a Jewish state, why are some Jewish people welcome and not others?
See the statement I heard somewhere, like where it's like everyone's equal except these. It's like, I don't know who said it, but I've heard it somewhere before. It's just, it's hard. It's just, look at that. It's like even amongst themselves, they have no concept of what they even are or what they want. It's,
yeah. I do want to acknowledge that we're a small audience here, and most of the audience is not Jewish, right? So we are not the ones who get to decide the answer on this, right? I'm presenting the question and I'm presenting the statement, but this is an intra-community conversation. This is something that Jewish people are talking about themselves and have debates on. And I do want to be sensitive to the fact that as outsiders to this conversation, we don't necessarily get a say, right? But it is interesting to consider, if this is a Jewish state, shouldn't all Jewish people be welcomed equally? So that's one thing to think about. Melissa, I don't want to call you out, but if you do want to say something, I do want to give you that opportunity. I want to be sensitive to that.
Everyone's fine. But yeah, to your statement, one would think that all, if it's a Jewish state, that all Jews should be considered equal regardless of geographic, like where their families came from geographically. And in terms of like the, even within the in-group, we can't decide what we are. I think it's very similar to political leanings, that there are people who think that Jews are Jews, regardless of whether, your whole lineage was Jewish, where, country of origin, things like that. And then there's extremists who like to put very tight bounds on things. And, yeah, those two groups don't agree very often.
Yeah, that's true. And I'm glad that you brought that up, and I'm glad that you sort of illustrated some of the conversations that are happening within the Jewish community or Jewish communities. Because again, I don't want this to turn into a monolith. I don't want this to turn into, I don't want to work to help the state of Israel merge Zionism and Judaism, right? That's their goal, and I'm not here to help them with that goal. Right. Melissa, was there anything else you wanted to say? Or?
I guess I was just thinking it's very similar to conversations that happen in America, like what is an American?
Mm-hmm.
You know, is it everyone or is it just people of specific European descent? And one makes sense and one doesn't, but that's neither here nor there for that part of the conversation.
All right. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here and for sharing as well.
Yeah, thank you for doing this.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go into a hypothetical, right? Would you support a state that has a belief in the divine right to rule a land based on a religious text or justification, the use of force to obtain what they believe is rightfully theirs, the use of discriminatory laws and practices to keep that divinely mandated land, and either a moral or historical tie to the land in question?
I mean, I'm curious to actually think if actually someone actually says yes to this.
Well, in many cases, there are many people who say yes to this, right?
Then I think I'll keep my extreme opinions to myself then, because honestly, this seems like it's like, as I'm a Muslim saying this, so the magical man in the sky told me this place belongs to me. Like, no, that's not how it works, you know. I'll keep it there, you know what I mean? So I don't want to go too far with this conversation.
Right. But it is interesting that you mention it as Muslim, because I'm going to present 3 places that fit this, and we will notice which ones are accepted and which ones are not, which ones are supported and which ones are not. 3 options: United States, a belief in the divine right to rule land, westward expansion, the use of force to obtain that, the use of discriminatory laws and practices such as the ethnic cleansing of Native Americans, the enslavement of Africans, right, to keep that divinely mandated land and work it, right? And then in their case, it wasn't a historical tie to the new continent, right? They didn't say like, oh, my white ancestors from Europe 10 billion years ago were here in North America somehow, right? That wasn't the thing. In their case, it was a moral argument. We are here to civilize these savages. We are here to bring them the word of God. We are here to better them, as the white man's burden compels us to, right? Israel, we already know, right? The divine right that there was a covenant with God to give them the land of Israel. Use of force, we've established. Discriminatory laws and practices to keep that divinely mandated land, and in many cases expand it. And for them, they both make the moral argument, right? Oftentimes, I didn't include this in my slides, but one of the big pros in terms of like Israeli settlement is like, well, you know, they fertilized the desert and made it beautiful. I'm like, anyone who's seen any pictures of Palestine pre-1947 knows that it's not like Kuwait where it's just a blank desert. There were olive groves and, you know, plants, and it was a very lush area. That's why it was consistently inhabited, right? Because it's easy to live there relatively, right? So there's the moral tie where we're bettering this land. Then there's also the historical tie. Well, we originally came from this land, right? And I'm not here to argue whether that historical tie is real or not. There's a lot of scholarship out there if you're interested to look into it, but I don't think that necessarily is the point, because all of the other points are bad enough, right? And then the last one is ISIS, right? This is the exact logic of ISIS, but we did not accept it, right? And I'm speaking as a Muslim, right? As a Muslim, there is a belief among some Muslims in a caliphate, a divine right to rule a land based on a religious text or justifications. Check. The use of force to obtain what they believe is rightfully theirs. Big check right there, right? The use of discriminatory laws and practices to keep that divinely mandated land. Now, ISIS never actually officially created any political system, right? Thankfully that they were never really given that chance. However, we can see in how they treated like the Yazidis and other minority groups that had they gotten power, they would have implemented discriminatory laws and practices to maintain their divinely mandated land. And then the last one, the moral or historical tie to the land in question, obviously from their point of view, they think they're doing morally the right thing, blah, 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 right? But the interesting thing is their historical tie is much more recent, right? We can think of all of the vast Arab empires and the caliphates and whatnot that existed. And those are much more recent history than a lot of the Jewish kingdoms in Israel. So if we were going to historical ties and we were going to use that as a justification, then ISIS is well within its right by that logic. I want to just say for the record, no, I do not support ISIS. No, I do not think they are right. I think this is a BS argument, and that's why I'm pointing it out. Right. Like Buli said, just because I happen to believe in an imaginary dude in the sky, I'm a Muslim. I do believe in a God, but I still am rational enough to realize that that doesn't entitle me to anything in the rest of the world. Until I can prove the existence of God, God is just my personal friend and nothing more. Right? We cannot base international law and international rules on religion. We've seen that fail throughout history. We already know this history. Just look at the Crusades, right? So again, it's interesting the exceptions we make, right? We're nowadays, right, especially with the conversations of critical race theory and education in the United States, right, we're really combating some of these foundational myths, right, about the founding of the United States. With ISIS, it was rejected right out of hand. But with Israel, it's in that middle ground where we don't want to reject it right out of hand, but we also aren't willing to look closely at its history like we are beginning to do in the United States. So again, just, I don't think we have enough time to really talk about Islamophobia and all these things, but it's an interesting thing to note of who we excuse and who we don't. Okay. So here's what none of these apologists for Israeli actions seem to ever ask. And if we're going to go with hypotheticals all the time, then why is the question never, why did Israel have to be an apartheid state? Why is segregation the foundation of Israel? If we're going to go into all these hypotheticals, why are we not questioning the very foundation of the creation of the state? Did Israel have to be an apartheid state? Or could they have just accepted the Palestinians there and just made them full citizens, right? With all the rights that a citizen is entitled to. Why was that not the scenario? I see a question. Say earlier, we discussed Israel as a Jewish state. Are there other modern countries who base citizenship on religion, not just countries with a majority of a single religion with a heavy influence on the culture? That is an interesting question, and I will admit that I'm not too well versed. I will say, in my understanding, citizenship is very hard to get in many places, but it's not necessarily an issue of religion. So for example, in Kuwait, it's almost impossible, regardless of how long you lived in Kuwait, to become a Kuwaiti citizen. My family, right, I'm third generation of my family that grew up in Kuwait and nowhere close to being citizens, right? But that's not a religiously based issue. There are, as Buli said before, there are Jewish Kuwaitis, there are Christian Kuwaitis, there are Muslim Kuwaitis. So it's not specified in religion. In many ways, it's specified on gender. So for example, a Kuwaiti woman, if she marries a non-Kuwaiti man, she cannot pass on her nationality to that man, right? Sorry, if she marries a non-Kuwaiti man, I think I said Kuwaiti, but a Kuwaiti woman, if she marries a non-Kuwaiti man, cannot pass on her citizenship to him. She cannot even pass on her citizenship to any of their children, right? It's not religious based, but it is draconian, and it is definitely based on sort of a racial purity, right? We want to keep the real Kuwaitis and get rid of the not real Kuwaitis, right? that would be, to my knowledge, the only thing that I can think of. I would be interested to know, like, what are the rules in the Vatican, actually, Vatican City? How do they operate? But I don't know enough myself to really answer that question, but it's a great question, and it's something I will definitely look into. Does anyone else happen to know more? Because if somebody else has this information, I'd like to share it now. Looks like we're all drawing a blank, maybe. What I'm going to do is I'm going to research this and just put a little addendum in the description for when I post this to YouTube, because my brain is like firing. Like, I want to know. I'm not going to sleep until I figure this out. But that is a great question. Was there a particular point in asking the question? Just curious if you were leading somewhere.
Trying to remember back to when we were talking about, like, kind of why a Jewish state. And it's like, as a Jew, I get the whole, we've been bullied and it is good to have a safe space. I don't like how we went about it. But I don't think anywhere else has done, like, well, Christians get this entire continent because there's a lot of us and we need a safe space for Christians.
Oh, okay. So I understand the question.
Or like what's happening, like you said with ISIS. I don't know if, like, the safe space argument is quite the same, but like, we should have a space for Muslims, and everyone's like, that's not how this works.
Yeah. Actually, now that I understand the question better, a great example would be Pakistan. As a Pakistani, right? Pakistan was created because the Muslim minority in India were being ill-treated. And so at first there was sort of this push for, a lot of people like to skip over this, but Nehru, Gandhi, and Jinnah being the founder of Pakistan, they were all working together in the Indian Congress. And the idea was that there would be minority rights that would allow equality for all, so that there would be no need to split. What was found was that that didn't necessarily work out in practice. And so Jinnah, being frustrated by the Indian Congress and feeling like they weren't really taking minority rights seriously, just like a contemporary of his, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, also criticized India for. His solution was, okay, well, if we're not going to get equal rights here, we should just get our own place, right? And so that's partition then happened. And knowing what I know about the partition, like, there were a lot of factors into it. It wasn't the British didn't agree with partition because they thought it was the right thing to do. They did it because they thought it was a policy of divide and conquer, and that they would, at that time, they still believed that they would eventually come back to India, that they would eventually take it over again. But in terms of Pakistan's citizenship, this is why I think that any ethno-state generally is doomed to fall into some form of fascism, right? Because if we look at the history of Pakistan, right, we can claim that the ideas behind the formation of Pakistan were very noble, right? We need a safe place because we're being discriminated against, and so we're going to live in this part. And for the most part, they were taking areas that were already Muslim majorities. There was displacement, there was forced expulsion, there was violence, but I wouldn't characterize it in the same way like settler colonialism is, where there's a completely new population coming in and just taking over, right? Doesn't excuse any of the violence or anything that happened. I don't want to make it that clear, but I do want to get into that nuance. And in Pakistan, right, so we have these noble beginnings. Well, what happens? We have East Pakistan and West Pakistan. And West Pakistan, where I am from, Punjabis, I'm ethnically Punjabi, right, decided that they wanted to be the supremacists in Pakistan and everybody had to follow them and their culture and their rules, right? The Punjabi dominance in Pakistan is a huge thing. There are many other ethnic groups, but the Punjabis have conquered all, as they say, right? So West Pakistan looks at East Pakistan, which is mainly made up of like Bangladeshi people, right? A different ethnic group, a different culture, and decides you're not Punjabi enough, you're not like us enough, we're going to treat you to all these terrible rules and laws, and we're going to persecute you, and we're going to oppress you. And then East Pakistan goes, yeah, no, this sounds like BS, I don't want this. And so they fight for their independence, right? In the 70s, there's a huge war, and the state of Bangladesh is established, right? So even with the good, noble intentions, I always feel like these sorts of states that are built on ethnic or racial or religious identities, like eventually, if you're going to lead to intolerance. And in Pakistan, this might be a future subject for a teach-in, actually, that I'm thinking about, is just look at what Pakistan is doing to people in Baluchistan. Ahmadiyas, right, are not considered Muslims. In fact, actually, I had a really weird, I'd never personally had to go in to renew my passport. You know, my dad always did that for me. And so this past year was my first time where I actually had to go in and do it myself. And one of the really jarring things was there was a paper, and in it I had to sign that I agreed that the Ahmadis were not Muslim in order to receive my passport, right? Like this was a transactional thing, right? And that was shocking to me. But what is that other than a form of supremacy? What is that other than a form of discrimination? And basically teaching that discrimination to your citizens by forcing them to do things like this. You know, it makes me wonder, what are the conversations in Pakistan that are happening? I'm not privy to those because I haven't been to Pakistan since like 2007. So it's been a long time. But you know, that was a culture shock moment for me. And I think that just reaffirmed my belief that these sort of states, whether they start with good intentions or not, they're doomed to fail in terms of human rights, because you cannot create a society just for one identity and be nice to all the other identities. That doesn't seem to be how it works. Does that make sense, Melissa?
It does. And that's one of like the biggest disappointments to me about what has happened in the state of Israel, is given the Jewish people's history, like it's just so antithetical to what we teach in our community.
Yeah. I mean, I would feel the same way. I feel the same way about Pakistan, right? When we talk about the founding of Pakistan, it's all these noble things about minority rights, and we just wanted our rights, but nobody would give it to us. And then now what does Pakistan do but trample over the rights of any minorities in their country? So yeah, that was, but I do want to look into more on this citizenship question, because I am curious about if there are other religious specific or ethnicity specific citizenship requirements in other countries. I'm just not very well versed in that. I only know like my background.
It'd be interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about the cycle. By now, hopefully throughout the history, what happened in May, what's happening today, and so on, right? You've probably picked up on the cycle of this conflict, right? So Israel has found the perfect formula to continue its settler colonialism in an age where we have purported to be beyond such concepts, right? We say that no longer do we live in a world where Europeans can travel to a place in Africa and then decide, you know, like, hey, we're just going to take all of Kenya. Kenya is ours now, right? We don't, technically the world says we're beyond settler colonialism. It was an ill of the past and it cannot be repeated. However, when we look at Israel, remember, we've established it's not a decolonization movement. If it's not a decolonization movement and it's not an independence movement, it's a colonization movement. And specifically, it's settler colonialism because they're bringing people from outside of the communities that live there to go and take up space and take up land and increase their power, right? So here's the cycle. Push for more expansion and agitation, right? Expel people from Sheikh Jarrah, expel people from Silwan, send your settlers out into the disputed areas between you and Syria, right? If we go through history, you'll find all of these examples. So push for more agitation and expansion. Wait for a response from the aggrieved parties. Oh, I'm attacking all these Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah, and now all of a sudden, Hamas is firing rockets at me. That's the opportunity. That's the opening. Claim it was an unprovoked attack because technically what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah is considered internal affairs by the world at large, even though it is Palestinian territory in what was supposed to be a Palestinian state. So it's unprovoked. They had no business firing on us. And because they fired on us, we have the right to defend ourselves. So we use violence, disproportionate violence, to subdue opposition and or attain more land, just like what happened in 1967, which remember that they had been planning to take over for years before the war presented the perfect opportunity, right? And then the last thing is where we are now, which is wait for the headlines to pass. Because Palestine's only ever in the news when there's rockets from Hamas. And when there are no rockets from Hamas, then who cares about the checkpoints? Who cares about the settlements? Who cares about the different laws? Who cares about the Jewish-only roads? Who cares about the apartheid wall? That's just day-to-day life in Israel. We only care when there's a headline. So they wait out the headline, then rinse and repeat. That's the cycle. I do also want to point out the cynical nature. So there's a cyclical nature, there's the cynical nature. The cynical nature is I'm a politician and I'm under some heat right now, like most recently Netanyahu, who is under investigation. Well, I need to distract people from this investigation. What will help? Oh, a war always helps. And he's not the only Israeli politician to actually use that. I believe either Ehud Barak or Olmert, one of the two of them had actually done that and is now currently in jail. Came back and he was convicted. Right. So this is the last part. And I think that pretty much everything that has been established has sort of gone into this, right? When you look at the history, when you look at the specifics, right, it seems very clear. And so you sit there wondering, well, then how come this is still happening? Why is this continuing, right? And this is where we really get into biased reporting and censoring dissent, right? So this is a quote from Nelson Mandela, again, looking at South African apartheid and Palestinian apartheid, or Israeli apartheid, really. Nelson Mandela saw it very clearly where they intersected. In fact, there's a really good documentary called Roadmap to Apartheid. It's on Amazon, and it's all about apartheid in South Africa and apartheid through Israel, and actually the shared histories they have, because apparently Israel was helping train the apartheid forces in South Africa, and they were regularly exchanging and became very close allies during that time. So Nelson Mandela says, the histories of our two people, Palestinian and South African, correspond in such painful and poignant ways. All right, so this last part, I'm just going to play this video from Al Jazeera, and this will really explain sort of the discrepancies in reporting, especially specifically in the West. So I'm going to mute myself so that there's no reverb. Here we go.
You're a well-known anchor at a major American news network. covering an ongoing story about an allied country engaged in a military assault against a population in a territory it illegally occupies. In the midst of this, a story breaks that your allies' military has now bombed a building that houses journalists. Is your reaction going to be dismay, condemnations, demands that journalists and other civilians be protected? Or is your response going to look a lot like CNN's Brian Stelter's?
I think the obvious question that comes to mind is, what were the Israelis supposed to do? If they are sure, if they had intelligence that can be vetted, that Hamas was using these news bureaus as a shield, as a hiding place, what were the Israelis supposed to do?
Covering Israeli occupation and apartheid seemed to be excruciatingly difficult for many major media outlets, especially here in the United States. There's a lot of sanitization of language, whitewashing of the situation, and an erasure of the real power imbalance that exists between Israelis and Palestinians, even an erasure of Palestinian humanity.
Do you support the protests, the violent protests that have erupted in solidarity with you and other families in your position right now?
We've seen this type of rocket fire during major operations and major wars.
Violence spiraling out of control in the Middle East, fires in Tel Aviv, military strikes, a neighborhood in Gaza. That began as a land dispute in Jerusalem.
Since May 11th, the Israeli military has been bombing Gaza. The airstrikes followed an escalation of ongoing Israeli state violence when worshippers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem were attacked by Israeli police during the last days of Ramadan. And this was following ongoing Palestinian resistance against the forced and illegal displacement of Palestinian families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in occupied East Jerusalem to make room for more Israeli settlers, a situation that isn't unique to this neighborhood. Almost immediately, English-language news media, especially U.S. outlets, chose a side under their guise of objectivity, and we can see it in the language that's been used. State-sponsored illegal forced displacement became evictions, something Mohammed Al-Kurd, a resident and writer from Sheikh Jarrah, called out on CNN.
To start, it's not really an eviction. It's forced ethnic displacement, to be accurate, because an eviction implies legal authority. While the Israeli occupation has no legitimate jurisdiction over the eastern parts of occupied Jerusalem under international law.
Israeli police attacks on Palestinian Muslim worshippers at the Al-Aqsa Mosque became tensions or clashes, a term which not only erases the genesis of the violence an occupying state force inflicts on the people it occupies, but also obscures the power imbalance between Israelis and Palestinians. A decades-long Israeli occupation of Palestine and a now recognized system of apartheid becomes a conflict, another term which presents the occupier and the occupied as equals. The Israeli military assault on Gaza, which at the time of filming this has claimed over 230 Palestinian lives, becomes a war between a heavily armed country and the people living on a tiny strip of land that it occupies. And if the war isn't with Gaza, then the war is with Hamas, whose military wing is up against one of the world's most technologically advanced and well-funded militaries, which is also the only country in the region with nuclear capabilities. And I'll throw it to John Oliver to quickly explain why Hamas rockets and Israeli bombs just don't make for a meeting of equals.
The use of the phrase tit-for-tat war in a conflict where you just pointed out one side has suffered over 10 times the casualties. Something which speaks to both the severe power imbalance at play here and how that often gets obscured by how we choose to talk about it.
In addition to sanitized language, there is also the passive voice, which suddenly becomes dominant in an industry where that's a big grammatical no-no. Palestinians aren't killed by Israeli bombs. They die. Israelis, however, are killed. Buildings aren't destroyed by Israeli airstrikes. They collapse after Israeli airstrikes. And mainstream coverage, even when it's good, like the Last Week Tonight segment, still often presents current events devoid of 7 decades of context. The recent events in Jerusalem can't simply be reduced to a flare-up or an escalation. Describing these events in this way and demanding a restoration of calm, whatever that means, diminishes the greatest act of violence that is inflicted on Palestinians on a daily basis, the occupation. All coverage and context needs to go back to that. Sheikh Jarrah does not exist in and of itself. It exists in the context of 7 decades of settler colonialism, whose purpose has been the dispossession and subjugation of the indigenous population. Attacks on Al-Aqsa don't exist in and of themselves, but are part and parcel of a long-existing Israeli strategy to dismantle and discourage Palestinian mass gatherings. This is especially true in this particular case when the attack followed protests against the continuing state-backed Judaicization of Jerusalem by forcing out the Palestinian population. And we can't talk about the West Bank without talking about how, among almost 3 million Palestinians, there are more than 700,000 illegal Israeli settlers. We can't talk about Jerusalem without pointing out how the Israeli-controlled city has a policy of keeping the ratio of Palestinians to Israeli Jews 40-60. That's an official policy to ensure Jewish dominance of the city. And then Gaza? We can't talk about Gaza without mentioning that it's a small strip of land the size of Detroit, home to 2 million Palestinians. There is no official border that demarcates it, and it's under siege from Israel by land, air, and water. Of the 2 million Palestinians in Gaza, 1.4 million are refugees who were expelled from or fled their homes due to the ethnic cleansing campaign carried out by Jewish militias before Israel's creation in 1948. These refugees, like all Palestinian refugees, were blocked by Israel from ever returning to their homes despite the United Nations demanding that they be allowed to. Now, American mainstream coverage of Israel, of occupied Palestine, isn't surprising when we look at how closely aligned the media establishment is with not only the American government, but its foreign policy interests. It's the same reason that this happened, that the American mainstream uncritically reported and amplified an Israeli strategy to make Hamas think that the military was going to do a ground invasion. And Israeli and pro-Israeli voices and perspectives dominate cable news shows and even daytime shows, despite the vast amount of Palestinian commentators available.
Do the Palestinians, even though they don't have a state, do they have the right to defend themselves?
What do you mean? They have the right to defend themselves from who? We are not attacking Palestinians.
What we have here is a terrorist organization, Hamas, on one side, and our ally, democratic ally, Israel on the other side, and therefore we have a responsibility to support Israel and its right to defend itself.
And it's not surprising that the New York Times, the leading newspaper of record, continues to use language and reporting which, at best, equalizes Palestinian and Israeli violence and suffering, and at worst, dehumanizes Palestinians. Since 1984, every New York Times Jerusalem bureau chief has lived in a West Jerusalem home that was ethnically cleansed of its inhabitants during the Nakba, which is what Palestinians call what happened in 1948. And the Times also has had staff and reporters covering the occupation in various capacities who have children who served in the IDF. How many Palestinian Jerusalem bureau chiefs has the Times had? How many Palestinian staff reporters does it have on the ground? Or how many Palestinian ground reporters does any other major American newspaper or cable outlet have on the ground? Now, everything that I just laid out might make the situation seem so incredibly dire, but this time there has been a bit of a shift.
This is a war crime. This is ethnic cleansing. You know, they can do all their propaganda and say that this is a private land dispute, but it doesn't take much looking at the history of this country and seeing how this country came about. It came about by stealing people's homes and stealing people's lands and destroying people's villages.
Palestinians are at best third-class citizens in the nation of their birth. The idea that it's even remotely controversial to call what Israel has imposed on Palestinians a form of apartheid is laughable.
United Jerusalem is a city that is a success story and will continue to be so.
Okay, well, according to Israeli reports, only 7% of the building permits issued in Jerusalem over the past few years have gone to Palestinians. They make up 40% of the city's population.
What we need is more than the cessation of violence. We need sanctions against Israel in order to put pressure on one of our time's apartheid regimes.
For the record, destroying a civilian residence sure seems like a war crime, regardless of whether you send a courtesy heads-up text.
Bolstered by the recent Human Rights Watch report, which supports what Palestinians have said for decades, terms like apartheid and ethnic cleansing have made it into the mainstream. And while there is a long way to go to significantly shift the narrative into one which doesn't give equal time, space, and moral footing to the occupied and the occupier, there are some suggestions that we are witnessing a change. And there is a part of me that wonders, in addition to the rising tide of progressive politics, how much of a role did the reckoning over racism in the U.S. media last summer following the George Floyd protests have to play in some of these changes? What we're seeing today is that Israel's structural racism and violence are no longer deniable. And both those who watch the news and those who make the news are boldly challenging the media and political establishment to call out Israeli apartheid and to stop protecting it and enabling it. So in the midst of filming this, we actually saw a leak of an internal CNN memo that said that the Ministry of Health in Gaza should be referred to as the Hamas-run Ministry of Health. Can't make this up. Thanks so much for watching. Stay tuned because we here at AJ Plus are working on a new show.
Just to echo, you can't make this stuff up. Literally.
It's absolutely disgusting. It really is. It's like just watching this, even though in all honesty, I'm living in the region. You're closer to home than this, especially since I live in Lebanon, or I live in Lebanon. We go through some things, like Israel has been a constant shadow over us. But when you see this, no matter how close you are to it, just seeing it just confirms that this is, excuse my language, horseshit. Like, this is being allowed to happen. It's not something it's being allowed to happen. Nations like America can stop it. They've shown multiple times throughout their history, they have the capability of stopping things at a whim. They can do it. Why they're not doing it? I'm not going to say it's obvious, because there's obviously something happening behind the scenes at play here. But there is an obvious benefit to America to keep the Palestinians subjugated. To them, I don't know what that benefit is, but this is not something new. It's something that's been ongoing for so long. And as much as the people will keep yelling and screaming, we must fight this oppression. When has the government ever gave a shit? Like, even in the case of the Black Lives Matter, this is their own people, their own citizenship, and they still can't get that right. So how do we, as Arabs, how do we expect any sort of help from this kind of institution? You know what I mean? It's boggling to think that the only source of help that we can hope to get is from a government that can't even treat its own people right, which is so ironic and so depressing that we live in such a world where humanity can't seem to get together and just literally say, okay, this is wrong, let's not do it. They have to justify with other crap. It's like, oh, no, it's defensive. Even if it is somehow defensive, the ratios aren't right. Okay, you want to defend yourself against a rocket attack, whatever. Not by nuking someone. It's like literally me throwing a slipper at you and then you throwing a nuclear bomb back at me. This is not.
It's not proportionate.
It's illogical as much as it not proportionate. Because we should, in the modern era we live in, we should not have to resort to such bullshit to live lives, because we call ourselves democratic, free, whatever. We are a disgrace, honestly. And I'm saying we because as humans, we should aspire to more. We should look at all these people and try to help them and not try to justify why we're demeaning them and throwing them under the. I don't care what religion or culture you are. It's like, you're human, you are like me. Just because we disagree on certain things doesn't mean I have the right to suppress you. It's absolute crap, honestly. Sorry, I went off on a tirade.
You're totally fine, Booby. To that point, again, the difficulty of this case, right, is if we decide that we have a responsibility to the Palestinians, do we have a responsibility to the war in Tigray that's going on right now? Do we have a responsibility to all the Uyghurs in China who are being ethnically cleansed? Do we have a responsibility to the Rohingya, right? And not many people are comfortable with those thoughts. Not many people want to have to think about it, because it doesn't just apply to what's going on today, it applies to things in the past, right? Where am I now? I'm on land that is called Portland, Oregon by the colonizers of this land. This is originally occupied Multnomah Chinookan land. And if I accept that, if I believe that, which personally I do, then that comes with a moral obligation and a responsibility, right? That I need to, in some way, make up for that. right? Whether it's through reparations or, you know, returning land or any of those movements, right? And those are difficult things to talk about and to think about. And so sometimes it's easier just to say, I'm just going to stick with this black and white version of the past, this intractable hatred between Muslims and Jews, and that's what this is, and there'll never be a cure because, you know, it's too complex, too complicated to ever, you know, find any peace. Instead of looking at the actual nitty-gritty of it, and then we find that it's not actually all that complicated. The complexity is used as a cover, right? So we're gonna end with, as a poet, I love poetry. You've probably heard of this before. This is Rafif Ziada, and this is the poem We Teach Life. It's a slam poem. And I think that it pretty much encapsulates sort of the catch-22, the no-win situation that Palestinians are in currently and have been in since Zionism decided to turn their attention away from Uganda and onto Palestine. All right, so I'm going to mute myself again, and we're going to press play.
I'll start with this poem. I wrote this poem when the bombs were dropping on Gaza, and I was the media spokesperson for the coalition, doing a lot of the organizing. And we had stayed up to about 6 o'clock in the morning, perfecting every soundbite. And by the end, if you're Palestinian, you know most Palestinians get tired and start pronouncing our P's as B's. So we become Palestinians by the end of the day. So I was practicing my P's all night. And the next morning, one of the journalists asked me, "Don't you think it would all be fine if you just stopped teaching your children to hate?" I did not insult the person. I was very polite. But I wrote this poem as a response to these types of questions we Palestinians always get. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre that had to fit into sound bites and word limits. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre that had to fit into sound bites and word limits, filled enough with statistics to counter measured response. And I perfected my English and I learned my UN resolutions. But still, he asked me, "Ms. Ziada, don't you think everything would be resolved if you would just stop teaching so much hatred to your children?" Pause. I look inside of me for strength to be patient, but patience is not at the tip of my tongue as the bombs drop over Gaza. Patience has just escaped me. Pause. Smile. We teach life, sir. Rafif, remember to smile. Pause. We teach life, sir. We Palestinians teach life after they have occupied the last sky. We teach life after they have built their settlements and apartheid walls. After the last skies, we teach life, sir. But today, my body was a TV'd massacre made to fit into sound bites and word limits. And just give us a story, a human story. You see, this is not political. We just want to tell people about you and your people. So give us a human story. Don't mention that word apartheid and occupation. This is not political. You have to help me as a journalist to help you tell your story, which is not a political story. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre. How about you give us a story of a woman in Gaza who needs medication? How about you? Do you have enough bone-broken limbs to cover the sun? Hand me over your dead and give me the list of their names in 1,200 word limits. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre made to fit into sound bites and word limits and move those that are desensitized to terrorist blood. But they felt sorry. They felt sorry for the cattle over Gaza. So I give them UN resolutions and statistics, and we condemn and we deplore and we reject. And these are not two equal sides, occupier and occupied, and 100 dead, 200 dead, and 1,000 dead. And between that war crime and massacre, I vent out words and smile, not exotic, smile, not terrorist. And I recount 100 dead, 200 100 dead, 1,000 dead. Is anyone out there? Will anyone listen? I wish I could wail over their bodies. I wish I could just run barefoot in every refugee camp and hold every child, cover their ears so they wouldn't have to hear the sound of bombing for the rest of their life the way I do. Today, my body was a TV'd massacre, and let me just tell you, there is nothing your UN resolutions have ever done about this, and no soundbite I come up with, no matter how good my English gets, no soundbite will bring them back to life. No soundbite will fix this. We teach life, sir. We teach life, sir. We Palestinians wake up every morning to teach the rest of the world life, sir.
That poem gets me every time. But this is the last part where really it's about taking action. So 2 things that you can do now are support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, BDS. There's an app called Boycott. I'll type it in and I'll put a link to it in the description of the video, but it's called Boycott, and it's a really cool app. It's not just about the occupation of Palestine, but you can actually use it to, like, if you are against prison labor, you can fill in these filters or these campaigns, and then when you go to the grocery store or something, you can just scan the barcode and it'll tell you, oh, this product is manufactured by someone who supports prison labor, or this product is manufactured or made by, you know, people in an Israeli settlement, right? Things like that. So that's one way to help you easily sort of move into BDS. Will and I have recently been better about it. I think it's actually very interesting. So because I grew up in an Arab country where Israel is, you know, you're not even allowed to say its name. Even in the news reports, they don't ever say Israel. They say the Zionist entity is what Kuwaiti newspapers call them. But I assumed growing up there that all the products that I used were safe in terms of BDS, right? If this is a country that does not acknowledge the existence of Israel, then they shouldn't have any products from them. That was a very childish mindset, because here I am in the US and scanning all these things with the Boycott app and realizing, oh my God, these things that I thought were safe because I used to buy them in Kuwait are not. They support Israeli apartheid. So that's one thing you can do. There's also pushing your local representatives to cut ties, right, with the state of Israel or with any, you know, is pro-Zionist apartheid groups or groups that support them. There's also petitions that you can sign, but really the main thing that Palestinians are asking currently, in addition to BDS, is to break the cycle that we talked about before, right? Once the headlines fade, attention fades, Israel goes back to normal, which is in their benefit. What Palestinians on the ground are asking is that everybody be vocal, especially in terms of your circles, in terms of your political groups, in terms of your social media, to make sure that people are still paying attention. And that was actually the reason why I decided to do this teach-in, was because there were direct calls from Palestinian people saying, hey, we need everyone to step up now. And I hope that after this, you have some information in the beginning to sort of help you be vocal about these things. As I said before, I'm going to have the link to the slides and all the resources and stuff in the description of the video, and those will be open to anybody, so people can just download them, and if they want to host their own teach-in or use that as a template to start their own thing, you're more than welcome to. My hope is that, as I said in the beginning, I've presented you information. It is your choice now to decide what you want to do with that information. Okay. So with that being said, thank you. Free Palestine.
Thank you for doing this.
If anyone has any questions or anything like that, I'll go ahead and stop the recording, and then we can just talk freely if you'd like.